Today, one of Paris's most popular attractions, the Notre Dame cathedral, is on fire. It's in flames as we speak. Authorities are saying that they think it's related to a restoration. They don't think it was criminal. It started at 6:50 p.m. Paris time, and it's spreading very quickly. The mayor also tweeted there that she wants everyone to respect the security perimeter just so people are safe. I want to bring in Malka Abramoff. She's one of our ABC producers who speaks French, and we're going to be going back and forth between French television so we can see exactly what's happening. So we want to listen in, and then Malka, you let us know what's going on.
En voyant ce spectacle terrible, avec, eh bien, c'est comme une immense cheminée, la cathédrale, et puis cette fumée jaune et noire qui s'élève des deux tours avec la toiture complètement en feu. Et ces petites lampes d'incendie semblent tellement
that is being posed right now is, can the stone resist the fire from Notre Dame? Another highlight is that firefighters aren't able to battle the fire right now. It's unclear why I wasn't able to hear the rest of the commentary, but that's a big thing. They're not able to use their resources to battle the fire. It's important to know that this is very emotional for French people of all faiths and backgrounds. As you said before, this is like the epicenter of like Parisian culture.
Yeah, a lot of people think of like the Eiffel Tower, but the Notre Dame is actually older.
That's right. Yeah. Lots of prominent historical and political figures have come to Notre Dame, and it's one of the like symbols of French liberation. They were saying, historians on French television. Oh, so sorry. And let me continue to listen to see if we can get any more information.
Avec cette proximité, ne serait-ce que ça, moi personnellement, ça m'inquiète quand je vois les flammes pareilles, parce que pour moi c'est tout le quartier là qui semble attaqué et en difficulté par les flammes.
Non, non, mais they're saying that it's as if the entire block is kind of engulfed in flames. This fire is spreading so quickly.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to look at it there too.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that we should point out is that this is the start of Holy Week in Paris, which is one of the busiest weeks. So for this to happen during this particular set of days is pretty crazy, no?
I mean, look at the skyline. This is totally devastating.
Yeah.
Ce triste spectacle parisien traumatisé par
I'm French, and this kind of like hits the heart. You know, it's as monumental as the Eiffel Tower. This is really, really sad.
Are they saying that it may be able to be contained or no?
I'm listening now. They're not talking about the fire, right? Like about crews.
Où toute la ville est stupéfaction, toute la ville est tournée vers le. Heureusement, avec beaucoup moins de gravité.
C'est vrai que
la stupéfaction est énorme. Regardez cette vue aussi.
Lots of people on the street watching this unfold.
Regardez, on le distingue. La flèche n'est plus là.
La flèche s'est effondrée.
La flèche s'est effondrée.
La flèche s'est effondrée.
La flèche de Notre-Dame de Paris.
All right, guys. For now, we want to end this here, and we want to go to a special report with David Muir.
Its first chance.
We just recap what viewers are seeing, and it is the Notre Dame, the cathedral in the center of Paris, that is on fire, and that fire is out of control, quite obviously, and smoke and flames are billowing from the building, and the roof has collapsed.
Tout à fait, je suis des fenêtres de mon bureau. Eh bien, nous avons vu il y a 10 minutes à peu près la flèche s'effondrer, s'incliner, et le feu a pris déjà depuis quelques heures.
This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, David Muir.
Good afternoon, I'm David Muir, and we come on the air at this hour with just extraordinary pictures coming in out of Paris right now. We want to show you firefighters as they battle a massive blaze at this hour, one of the most iconic churches really in the world. You're looking at the iconic Notre Dame Cathedral, where a fire broke out within the last hour to an hour and a half. We've been watching these images play out in our newsroom all afternoon. Flames, black smoke, you can see shooting from the base of the medieval church's spire. It's unclear how this fire broke out, but there are people all throughout Paris watching this unfold. They're about 6 hours ahead of us here, New York time, so that would make it about 8 p.m. In Paris. Look at this, just a stunning image of that billowing smoke. We do know that there had been construction at the church, some sort of renovation underway. For those of you who might have been lucky enough to have traveled to Paris recently, you would be familiar with that scaffolding surrounding the spire of the church, though it's unclear about whether or not this fire was sparked by that construction. This is a wider view of Paris right now that you're looking at. You can see the flames are visible, not just the smoke, but the flames as they now engulf the iconic Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. As you know, this comes amid High Holy Week, Easter just a little more than a week away now, and you can see the flames. Wow, I haven't seen this image yet. The flames literally lighting up the spire. And there were witnesses on the ground who had reported pieces of debris, small embers in the air that were dropping on the people who had surrounded the Notre Dame Cathedral to watch this as it unfolded. People who weren't even right there at the cathedral feeling the effects of this. And I know emergency crews are on the scene, not only trying to figure out what they will do to try to save what's left of the Notre Dame Cathedral, but also to try to get people to safety because of those embers, those pieces of the church that have now begun to fall from the sky in and around Paris. Again, it's 2:01 Eastern here. You're looking at live coverage. The pictures from Paris at this hour, just catastrophic. The Notre Dame Cathedral, again, one of the most iconic cathedrals in the world and the most iconic, certainly in Paris, engulfed in flames at this hour. There is no word on what has caused this fire, though we do know in several of the shots you can see the scaffolding surrounding the spire, that medieval spire that's so famous. This church, of course, an ancient church that has been part of the landscape in Paris for so many decades, and for tourists not only from America but from all over the world. This is, you know, right up there with the Eiffel Tower as one of the most iconic places to visit when you're in Paris. And as I mentioned, Good Friday approaching, Easter approaching, and you can just imagine the number of people who have made that trip or who plan to make the trip during this holy season to try to see that church. It's also, as I mentioned, just 6 hours ahead in Paris, which means there probably are a number of tourists who were still in the area checking out the majestic beauty of Notre Dame. And we are joined by Terry Moran, longtime foreign correspondent for ABC News. He's with me on the phone from our Washington bureau. And Terry, I know you're just as stunned as I am as we watch these images come in.
Well, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking, David. It is. Notre Dame is not just a church. It's the heart of France, really. It is a place that is a testament to the history of France and a place where the French people have rallied around in times of trouble. And it is also, obviously, a place that is built to the glory of God. So this is a tragedy not just for the people of France, but for the people, you know, of the Christian faith around the world. It is one of the great churches of the world as well.
Just the sheer age of this church, the history of the church, the cathedral, they began construction in 1160. The church is 850 years old, largely completed by 1260, though, as we know, it's been modified over the course of several centuries. You're watching French television carry these dramatic pictures live across France at this hour. That's the feed you're looking at right there. We do know that French President Emmanuel Macron had postponed a televised speech he had planned to make to the nation because of this massive fire. And one of the main questions we were talking about down in the newsroom before we came on the air here was, you know, where is the response? We watched this for quite some time. You can see the police car there, and there is certainly emergency presence now on the scene, but there did not appear for quite some time, Terry, to be, you know, firefighters. We know where Notre Dame is. It's a fairly isolated area, an isolated part of Paris, and it would be difficult to get, you would think, fire crews en masse there quickly, but it was some time before we even saw emergency vehicles on the scene.
Well, it's it's a medieval church, and it's built in a medieval neighborhood. You can imagine those narrow streets on the Ile Saint-Louis and right in the center of Paris there. And it is very difficult to bring as much firefighting equipment as you'd need. Look at that. The roof is going up in flames. As you've talked about, these are 800-year-old timbers. These medieval cathedrals, not just triumphs of stone masonry, but also of timber construction. They are held up by these massive timbers now centuries old, and to get the amount of firefighting equipment that is needed to that location is very difficult. And for people, the French people looking at this, this is, as I say, the heart of their history. One thinks of Charles de Gaulle, the great French patriot and leader who really held up French honor and the Free French Army back in 1944. When he joined the liberation of Paris, he spoke there, and there was gunfire going on. This has been a battleground as well as anything else, David.
Again, you're watching live coverage here on ABC News. This is French television that we're getting a feed in from right now as we watch the flames shoot out from the spire of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. As Terry and I have been saying, just the sheer age and the history behind this cathedral, world famous, built in the 12th century. It's been modified over the course of many centuries, and again, there was scaffolding surrounding the base of this spire for really some time now. Some would suspect perhaps that might be where the fire started. Look at the size and scope of those flames. That's truly breathtaking. And of course, the question at this hour for so many people who are watching this unfold in Paris, people on the street, in awe by what they're witnessing. Reports of ash and pieces of the church actually falling from the sky there in Paris. I want to bring in an American who is in Paris, John Dickinson. He's a visiting professor, and John Dickinson is on the phone with us. John, you can see the fire from where you are?
Yes, I'm watching it from my balcony right now.
We can hear the emergency vehicles there behind you. That was one of the questions we had, John, which was how difficult is it to get, first of all, firefighters to the scene? And we were wondering, because so many of these are aerial shots or from fairly high up, it's hard to see the firefighting presence on the ground. What can you tell us about the emergency response?
So I'm looking at it from basically, I'm at the same level as the roof of Notre Dame, and it's just sickening to watch. This is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, and for the last hour we've been watching the roof caving in, and we've been seeing the flames coming out. There's crowds on the sidewalks in front of my house, and people are just devastated
John,
watching this building burn.
It's
such an icon of the country and of Western civilization, and there's.
John, just stick with us here. I'm taken by the spire, which we have just seen. John, just pause for one moment, if you will. The spire of the Notre Dame Cathedral we have just witnessed collapsing amid those flames and the smoke pouring from the top of that iconic theater. That is that will take your breath away looking at that. Again, this 12th century cathedral, as we all know, famously the Seine right beneath it. So many people, Americans included, have traveled from all over the world to see Notre Dame, and we know that in these holy days ahead there were going to be even larger crowds with Easter approaching. And you can see this is the wider view of Paris, the billowing smoke, and for some time as we were monitoring this before we came on the air, you could certainly see the smoke and then the flames, and now we know the flames fully engulfed that spire. The spire has now come down to the top of the cathedral. There was hope early on that firefighting crews could get to that cathedral with enough time to save much of that, quite frankly, stunning architecture, the stained glass, but that spire right there, that will be the image, certainly bringing horror to the people who live there in France and who can appreciate that monument. But for those of us watching from all over the world, given the history and the beauty of the Notre Dame Cathedral. John Dickus, my apologies for interrupting you. We were just watching that image come in now, and I'm sure if you can't see it from your vantage point, you certainly can see it in the coverage there in France. The fact that the spire is now tumbled and that cathedral is, much of it, fully engulfed in flames.
We actually watched the spire come down about 2 minutes ago from our apartment. My partner started crying.
We can see the crowds right now, John, on the ground, just watching as this plays out. And there were reports from witnesses on the ground, and these aren't even the people who were right there at the cathedral, the people who were spread out all over Paris, that the embers were falling from the air, and that there's also a secondary concern, obviously, for the people in the area.
Yeah, absolutely. The sky is full of smoke, and you can smell it. Just standing on our balcony, you can smell it in the air. It's happening right in front of us, and it's just sickening to watch.
John, can you tell us why you're in Paris, how long you've been there? I know that you're a visiting professor. What do you teach there in Paris? For how long have you called it home?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we've lived here almost 2 years now. My partner works for an international organization, and I'm a visiting lecturer at Sciences Po University. I teach graduate students here about international affairs, international security.
Well, certainly they are going to be transfixed, as we are, by the images playing out in Paris. John Dickus, an American who is a visiting professor there, as you just heard him say, watching from his vantage point. He saw the spire collapse himself, as we have now all seen around the world, and that just stunning image as the flames engulf really the entire top of the Notre Dame Cathedral at this point. You can see the black billowing smoke there to the right, and the scope of the flames now, and you just have to wonder. Obviously, we're talking about an 11th century church. There probably wasn't much inside to protect it from a fire of this scope. The only question now is how much of it, if at all, will be saved as we watch this catastrophic fire ravage the Notre Dame Cathedral, which in some parts of the world, and particularly there in France, can be called Our Lady. Still in use by the Roman Catholic Church for Sunday Mass, and so many people travel from all over the world to take part in that Mass. And as I have mentioned here as we're on the air, we have Good Friday and Easter approaching, and so many Americans and people there in Paris were likely planning to observe the holiday from the pews in that historic church. I want to bring in Alistair Bruce from Sky News, a colleague of ours, a respected colleague and a longtime journalist for Sky News. And Alistair, this is just a unfortunate and saddening all over the world image that we're watching play out here at Notre Dame Cathedral.
It's absolutely devastating. I used to go when I was much younger to play the organ in that cathedral and know what an important icon it is for the people of Paris and of France. And it really has been at the center of French history, going right back to the 12th century and the 11th century when it was built. And we saw that spire, or the flesh, collapse earlier on, and the original one had been put up in the 13th and 14th centuries, and there was a new one put up in the 18th century. And what's so tragic about what it means to Roman Catholics living in France is that this is in the very heart of the ancient capital city, on this tiny island where the kings of France used to live. And up in that spire, in the little cathedral that used to mark the direction of the wind, used to be kept a tiny piece of the True Cross and a little bit of St. Denis and St. Genevieve, who were the two patron saints of Paris. So this is a hugely important place for Catholics, for the history of France, and it has been at the center of the story of the Parisian people almost since the Frankish people first established a great monarchy and a great center of power and influence in that part of the world.
Alistair, you spoke of playing the organ as a boy at Notre Dame. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's been able to say that before. And obviously there is concern at this hour about whether or not anything inside that cathedral will be saved. We've now been watching these flames for well more than an hour and a half here, but certainly you must be concerned as you look at these images about what, if anything, will be saved.
What I find fascinating is that there was a reservoir of water kept between the two main towers in order to deal with a fire should it occur. Now, for some reason, there has not been a possibility to deploy that, or we will find out later on. But I know from the cathedrals that I still visit, and I adore visiting these old buildings, most of them put up centuries ago. They're full, originally, of tinderbox dry wood, which is around the strength of which the great stone ceilings are built. And you can imagine that on top of that, you've got lead, which is the most resilient metal to create a roof. But once the fire gets into those old timbers and then is further heated by the sheer strength of the heat in burning lead, it is incredibly difficult for anybody to manage that fire. And I would imagine that this is the greatest tragedy to the arts of France that we are witnessing now, and it will take almost 100 years to put it right.
You describe perfectly the architecture and how old it is, the lead that surrounds the wood, but once you get to the wood, how quickly it ignites and how likely little hope there is at this point other than protecting people in the vicinity and other structures in the vicinity of Notre Dame Cathedral. But much of this fire is going to be, certainly, it would seem, allowed to do its destructive work, at least when it comes to the spire, which we've already seen collapse, the top of the cathedral now on fire. You were listening to the description from Alistair Bruce, a colleague of ours at Sky News overseas, who once as a boy used to travel to Notre Dame to play the cathedral. We do have a tweet. It's in French, but from President Emmanuel Macron, and the translation reads at this hour, "Our Lady of Paris in flames, emotion of a whole nation. Thought for all Catholics and for all French. Our thoughts with them, like all of our countrymen. I'm sad tonight to see this part of us burn." That from President Emmanuel Macron, who we know was set to address the nation of France tonight in a taped speech that had been prepared beforehand. He was set to describe how he would react to the protests that we have been reporting on here in recent weeks in France about the economic divide in that country that appears to be growing. But certainly tonight, that's not what sort of consumes this country and really the world in looking at France right now. That's a tight shot. We can see the people there on the balcony. You can likely see it at home even closer than I can see here in the studio. But we are joined now by Anne Lester. She's a medieval historian. And Anne, I'm not sure if you're able to see images of this to watch along with us, but just the sheer scope of watching such an iconic, 12th century cathedral go up in flames.
Yeah, I'm looking from my office, streaming online, and it's absolutely devastating, as you say. I think for anyone who's visited, who's been there, who's studied it, like I have and my colleagues have, this is shocking and deeply saddening.
And can you talk to us a little bit about, we have been lucky enough to travel to France to see the Notre Dame Cathedral, the Seine right below it, but this is a somewhat confined area in that beautiful and historic part of that stunning city, and likely it was quite difficult for firefighters to get to the scene and quickly. When we see fires, obviously here in America, we see teams arrive so quickly, but we were watching these images and it seemed to be quite some time before we saw emergency vehicles on the scene.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, Notre Dame is on the Ile de la Cité, and so the only way on to the island is across bridges. And, I know that the firefighters in Paris train there. They train for these, in fear of these events occurring, and are certainly prepared, but it is no easy task, absolutely. And, it was designed to be both well fortified and safe, as well as the kind of jewel at the center of what was a royal city from the time, really, of Paris's very origins, but certainly from the medieval period onward. Yeah. Yeah,
you describe it as a jewel, the perfect word. And, Notre Dame is the most visited destination in Paris. 13 million people visit the cathedral every year. 35,000 a day go to pray at the cathedral. And, of course, as we've been mentioning with our live coverage here of just a stunning sight, the cathedral at Notre Dame up in flames at this hour in Paris, that Good Friday is approaching, Easter Sunday approaching. And I want to get back to John Dickus, the American who is a visiting professor in Paris and who witnessed that spire collapse. And John, as you've been listening to this discussion here, the concern over how quickly emergency teams were able to get there to try to save. We can see now the hoses and some of the spray on that fire, but it certainly just seems to be overwhelming the authorities there on the ground.
Yeah, there's no question. I'll tell you for me, the most heartbreaking moment was when I saw about 20 minutes after I started watching the fire, I saw the ladders go up and the hoses start spraying, and it was just heartbreaking to watch. The ladders were not tall enough. The hoses were not strong enough. This was just clearly a fire beyond the capacity of the crew's capabilities. I mean, they were clearly doing everything they could, and it was just so much bigger and so much more out of control than they had the resources to deal with. And it's just devastating to watch.
Describe for us again the moment you saw the spire, perhaps one of the most iconic parts of that cathedral. It really defined the look of that cathedral for so many people who come to visit it. The stained glass windows, but of course that spire that we have watched tumble. What that was like for you, John?
There's no question that was the most horrifying moment. My partner and I were standing on the balcony watching. That was the moment that she started crying when we watched that spire fall down. It's just, it's such an iconic part of the Paris skyline. It's such a a symbol of worship for so many people, and to see it come down like that. We both moved to Paris from D.C., so of course this took us back to 9/11. I mean, that was sort of a natural association for us. I certainly hope that no one has been killed at Notre Dame, but I mean, in terms of just the confusion and the sense of shock that people are feeling, it's awful to see. And the streets in front of my house right now are just choked with people. The emergency trucks seem to be having a hard time getting through. People are just sort of paralyzed and transfixed watching this beautiful, iconic building collapsing in front of them.
I want to get back to a point you made there, John. We can hear the emergency vehicles behind you. You're listening to John Dickus, a professor in Paris. He's an American who's lived there for about 2 years now. He's witnessing this fire, has been watching it, along with much of Paris. He's described the crowds in the streets. What else can you see as far as the scope of the actual fire? Of course, we're watching in live pictures, not only on French television, but from a number of places around Paris. People are on social media carrying this live. But just give us the scope of how you watch this grow right before your eyes.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. I was actually sitting at my dining room table working. I was preparing a lecture for my class tomorrow, and I noticed that on the bridge in front of my house, a whole crowd of people had stopped on the bridge, looking over the river, and they were all facing west, and you sometimes see that happen when there's a beautiful sunset or something like that, but it was several hours before dark, so I couldn't figure out what was happening. So I walked out on my balcony to see what could be drawing the crowd's attention, and I saw that a fire had at that point just started. It had started right under the spire of the cathedral, and it took a minute to realize how devastating this was going to be. At first, the fire looked scary, but the building is so huge, it was hard to get a sense of how big the fire was when it was just under the spire before it had spread. And so everyone was sort of hopeful at first that this would be something that the emergency crews might be able to control, or something that could be brought in line. Certainly, my partner started texting me as she was on her way home from work, and I was talking about watching the ladders go up and the hoses start spraying, and they couldn't even reach the fire at first. I mean, for half an hour, it looked like they weren't able to get any water on it from my vantage point, and you started to see the flames crawling up the spire, and you started to see sections of the roof coming down, and it's wrenching to see one of the most beautiful buildings in the world just collapsing in front of you like this.
Yeah, it is heartbreaking, and we're looking at live pictures. You're watching ABC News live coverage of this devastating fire that is playing out in France at the Notre Dame Cathedral now, 2:22 Eastern. That makes it about 20 after 8 in Paris. You can see the clouds of smoke. You can certainly be seen all across that city. But for those who are close, particularly like John Dickus, who we've been talking to during our live coverage, this has been quite devastating to witness firsthand. The people in the streets of Paris looking up at this destructive fire, and we've watched the spire collapse in this live coverage, and just to see the scope of the flames as they shoot up through that structure, it would look to be destroyed, certainly the top of the cathedral. But this cathedral has a storied history about surviving not only conflict but destruction before, during the French Revolution, and obviously during World War II. The liberation of Paris, 1944, the cathedral suffered damage then as well. Stray bullets, snipers on the roof, but this is going to be an enormous challenge for this cathedral to survive the scope of this. As you look at this vantage point, the smoke there, I'm just taking in the pictures along with all of you at home. There are so many people who are carrying this, on their smartphones, these pictures live, and it's sort of a reflection of the times that we're in. But with each new vantage point comes the realization that much of the top of this cathedral, at least, has been destroyed. The race is on, Terry, to see how much of it can be saved. And we were talking with Alistair Bruce, as you know, Terry from Sky News, who described as a boy being able to go to Notre Dame Cathedral to play the organ. But we have discussed here how difficult it is for firefighters and crews to get there. And you can see the one hose in the bottom right of your screen. But he and so many of the other observers have said they're outnumbered by the scope of this fire.
It is really the threat to all these beautiful old cathedrals. Fire, so many of them were destroyed. I've been to Utrecht in the Netherlands, and a magnificent old cathedral, St. Martin's, brought down by fire over the years. And as you said, over the centuries, Notre Dame has survived for so long, but it has seen a lot of damage as well. The French Revolution, when the revolutionary leaders wanted it desecrated and vandalized, and they did a tremendous amount of damage. There was talk of it being torn down at that time. And it was Napoleon who really led the way to restore it. He was crowned there. And then during the World War II, when the liberation of Paris happened, Allied troops coming, and there was gunfire and fighting around Paris, Charles de Gaulle, the great hero of France, the Free French leader, as soon as he got to Paris, he went straight to Notre Dame. He knew, leader that he was, charismatic leader that he was, that was the heart of France. And as he got out of the car, machine gun fire erupted. There was a battle there, almost making it an even more sacred place in the French national imagination. But as others have said, this is one of the most sacred sites of Christianity. It's an old and magnificent church, and it has seen so much. Joan of Arc is associated with it as well. This means so much to the people of France, to Catholics and Christians around the world, and really this is one of the triumphs of European civilization that we're watching go up in flames. It was a bold statement when it was built those 800 years ago. Imagine the most modern building you can. That's what Notre Dame looked like to the people of the time. Those soaring, flying buttresses, the roof so high that we now see coming down, took people's breath away. It seemed like a miracle. And it was all done to the glory of God and to the glory of France, no doubt. And now it will have to survive this as well. It has survived so much over the centuries. It will survive. But as Alistair pointed out, it is going to take a long, long time.
Terry, as you said there a moment ago, it took their breath away in the 12th century. And the images all of these centuries later taking our breath away right now. And as you mentioned, it will survive in some shape or form, but it's just at this moment devastating to see that spire. That was the moment before it collapsed, fully engulfed in flames there. We do know that there was a major renovation project underway, a $7 million renovation on the church's spire, and it's 250 tons of lead inside the spire. Max Miafidis joins us now. He's an eyewitness, and he's there in Paris. And Max, can you describe what you've witnessed as much of the world now prays for Paris?
For sure. So what actually happened, you first of all have to know that the roof of the cathedral actually took on fire. So we arrived at the beginning, and what happened is that the whole roof of the cathedral was actually burning. And a few minutes ago, you probably seen it from the videos and the image that you've seen on the social media. Actually, the arrow with the cross, the religious cross, actually fell down. So right now, it's just kind of a chaotic situation. Like there is the police everywhere around. Everything is buckled up. Like you cannot go anywhere. We're actually closing the bar right now, and everything is being shut down. So, yeah, this is pretty much chaotic, and it's around 600 years of history that are burning down right now.
600 years of history, as you say. You also described the entire roof in flames. You know, it certainly looks devastating from the images that we're seeing, but it's hard to get a real scope of how much of the cathedral is actually on fire right now, Max.
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, half of the cathedral is on fire. What you have to know is, because everything is in wood, the fire is spreading very, very rapidly. So we had some firefighters that were brought up by trucks and everything, and they're trying to, put it down and slow the fire and make it, just extinguish. But what's happening is that because there is wind today, it's actually not happening at all. So, yeah, I would say that a good half of the cathedral is probably coming on fire, and because the main structure is in wood, it's probably going to spread even more. So it's not looking very good right now, but we'll see.
And Max, just give us an idea. We've been seeing images here of people, and I'm not sure whether they're workers who were part of that construction project renovating that spire, but there are, for every once in a while in these live pictures, you see workers on balconies, it would appear, surrounding the cathedral. I don't know from your vantage point if you can see those people, and certainly the hope at this point is that no one has been injured, but it would seem those workers are very close to these flames.
Yeah, so you're right. Actually, there were people working on the cathedral at that time, and it's probably what set on the fire, because we have no information right now about, like, the police don't want to tell us or anything about how it started, but we are pretty sure that it came from here. But these people should be safe at the moment I'm speaking, because we arrived right at the beginning, and there were actually no one on these shelves and everything. So it was pretty clear. I'm entirely sure, 90% sure that everyone is safe, but like the damage are just going to be way more moral than probably physical at this point.
We're seeing pictures. Max, thank you very much. That was extraordinarily helpful, and we're sorry for what you're witnessing up close and what the world is now watching. We're seeing pictures come in right now on French television of President Macron. He appears to be in this moment being briefed by authorities as he approaches the fire and is being brought up to date on this just devastating blaze, now not only consuming certainly the top part of that iconic cathedral in Paris, but consuming us all over the world in our horror and disbelief that such an iconic structure in Paris is now going up in flames. As he now arrives at the scene, we do know that he tweeted earlier, and as we mentioned, one of the ways that they talk about Notre Dame is as Our Lady, and he tweeted out, Our Lady is burning tonight. Of course, they're 6 hours ahead in Paris, which would make it about 8:30 p.m. in Paris. President Trump has also tweeted, saying, so horrible to watch the massive fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. He added in his tweet, perhaps flying water tankers could be used to put it out, must act quickly. The president certainly reacting to some of the questions we had early on, which was just how quickly could they get emergency relief firefighters to the scene. As you look in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, I'm really struck by some of these images. Every once in a while, you'll see sort of one hose from one particular direction, this one in particular taking aim at those flames, but it would certainly seem that they are vastly outnumbered in strength and in power, the sheer force of this fire. And in talking to Alistair Bruce earlier from Sky News, as a boy going to the cathedral himself and describing the architecture, the structure, the lead surrounding that ancient wood that keeps so much of that cathedral in its glorious form, is also now being preyed upon by the heat and the strength of these flames as that wood, that part of the church now goes up in flames. Again, there is certainly a guessing game at this hour as to what could have caused this. We do know there was a $7 million renovation project, the scaffolding surrounding the spire on the top of that cathedral. And our foreign correspondent, James Longman, is watching this unfold along with us. And James, you have reported on the political turmoil in Paris these last few weeks on World News Tonight for us. And certainly this is going to be just one more chapter of heartbreak for the people of France. It's been an unsettling time in that country, and this is going to really hit everyone.
Yeah, absolutely, David. They've been going through the Gilets jaunes protest, the Yellow Jacket protest movement about living standards and the rising cost of living there. Macron, as you say, President Macron has come under increasing pressure to address those issues. But time and time again, when we've been to France to report on whether it's those sorts of protests or terrorist attacks, unfortunately, over the last few years, France has been a target there. The French have this capacity to unite when things go wrong, and this is certainly a night to unite. I mean, watching this, we've all been saying it, it's absolutely terrifying. We are not very far here in London from our cousins over in France, and it's very sad for us to be watching what's going on. But the French do have this capacity to find strength in the darkness, and they're going to need it here. This is absolutely, you know, it's a terrifying thing to watch. And as you keep saying, this one hose of water keeps going for that the center of the fire there, but it doesn't seem to be enough. And we're watching as emergency services appear at the scene. Some of their cranes don't seem to be able to go high enough to tackle the blaze. So certainly there's still a lot of work to go as we watch now. France, you know, the dusk is approaching now over Notre Dame, and we know now that Emmanuel Macron, we're hearing now on French news, the French president and the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, they are both on the scene being briefed by their officials, hoping, praying that this can be brought under control soon.
James Longman watching from our London bureau, and James, who has reported extensively on the protests in recent weeks in France that have not let up. In fact, President Macron, who is now on the scene being briefed by authorities, was set to address the nation tonight in a televised speech, one that had been recorded earlier, about the social unrest in his country that so far is not letting up. Instead, he's now facing another, certainly far more urgent crisis in Paris, and that is the fire engulfing much of the Notre Dame Cathedral. He did tweet a short time ago, "Our Lady of Paris in flames, emotion of a whole nation." He added thoughts for Catholics, and as we have mentioned here, and it bears repeating, it's Good Friday approaching, followed by Easter, and so many make that voyage to Paris and to the cathedral at Notre Dame to pray during these holy days. And the president there adding, like all our countrymen, I'm sad tonight to see this part of us burn. John Dickus is a professor in Paris. He is an American citizen, but he's been living there for 2 years. And John, there are descriptions coming in to me now about people on the bridges over the Seine simply in awe and shock and watching this as dusk falls over the cathedral as it continues to burn there in Paris. John Dickus, if you're still with us, we're getting descriptions coming in now. In fact, one quote just handed to me now from the Notre Dame spokesman André Finot telling French media, quote, "Everything is burning, nothing will remain from the frame." The 12th century cathedral, obviously home to incalculable works of art, one of the most famous tourist attractions in the world. And obviously, as we've been on the air now for the better part of 40 minutes or so, there is hope, certainly on our end, and prayers in Paris that something will be salvageable from the cathedral in Notre Dame. Some of those, you know, jewels on the inside, the art, the stained glass. But from your vantage point, how much of that do you think will even be possible?
I gotta say, when this fire first started about an hour and a half ago, I was hopeful that they'd be able to get it under control. And from my balcony, I would say it's devastating right now. We just saw another portion of the roof collapse. We can see they've got a second hose that's hitting the flames now, but it's just the hose and the water stream is so small compared to the size of the fire, even as the fire has started to burn itself down a little bit. The one thing we're still holding out hope for is the two towers, the big towers at the front of the cathedral. The entire time we've been watching, we haven't seen any flames coming out of the towers. We haven't seen any flames coming up the towers. So we're still holding out hope that those towers are going to stay standing when this is done.
No, and John, I was struck by what you said there a moment ago, saying we now see a second hose, and just the mere idea that you can see from your vantage point only two hoses now at work trying to take down this massive fire that's engulfed the roof and certainly much more of the Notre Dame Cathedral at this point. The roof in the beginning as we started monitoring this, and now we've watched the flames overtake much of that cathedral. We know that Parisians are in the streets. They're along the Seine. They are watching, aghast and in horror as this fire engulfs one of the most famous cathedrals in the world, and certainly the most famous in Paris. The spokesman for the Notre Dame Cathedral telling French media at this hour that the entire wooden frame of the cathedral they suspect will likely come down, that it's not just the spire we saw some time ago, but that the entire wooden structure they're predicting will come down. They are certainly concerned about people in the area. There were reports from witnesses that embers burning from the church carried in the sky over the streets of Paris, that some of those were falling on people below, and that emergency teams were moving them back. But again, at this hour, the entire wooden frame of the cathedral at Notre Dame in flames. They fear it will all come down. And the quote I mentioned a moment ago is quite something. The spokesperson for Notre Dame Cathedral saying everything is burning, nothing will remain from the frame. Of course, the cause of this catastrophic fire, unknown at this hour. There is speculation. When the fire first broke out, you could really clearly see the scaffolding surrounding that spire. And for those of us who have been lucky enough to have traveled to Paris, you're familiar with that scaffolding. There you see much of it there. This $7 million renovation project for that ancient spire on the top of the cathedral. There is speculation that perhaps the fire was potentially linked to that renovation, though we do not know that for sure. They were renovating the spire. It's 250 tons of lead in that spire. Paris police say so far there are no reported injuries or deaths. We were watching some pictures of those workers at different locations at the cathedral, on balconies, it would appear. And let's just hope that everyone has gotten to safety as this has played out. Steve McGill joins us now. He's the Jersey City Fire Chief. And Steve, you're no stranger to trying to knock down massive fires, but this one brings with it extraordinary challenge because of the sheer nature, the history of this cathedral, and the isolated area. And for those who've been to Notre Dame, you know how difficult it is with the Seine just beside it. It's literally to walk to get there. And we have eyewitness reports that the streets are clogged not only with people, but making it difficult for emergency vehicles to get there.
Yeah, those type of structures are very difficult to get to. And, yeah, due to the terrain, like you mentioned, water supply is going to be a big issue. And just getting the apparatus and equipment up there is a big issue. The major issue with these type of buildings, though, is the construction. They're what we call heavy timber, which is very large wooden structures and beams. And once they catch fire, they're very difficult to put out. And there's a lot of potential for fire spread. Those type of buildings, there's also large voids in the ceiling area where if fire gets into that, very difficult to get to due to the height of the ceiling. And there's a lot of collapse hazard potentials in these type of buildings.
I mean, we're talking about a 12th century cathedral, and obviously it's been renovated many times over the course of several centuries here. But to try to retrofit something as historic and beautiful as Notre Dame with the kind of firefighting, aids that we are familiar with here in the U.S. In this day and age, that's a pretty difficult feat to try to prepare a Notre Dame Cathedral for a flame of this scope, fire.
Yeah, and most churches aren't equipped for that type of things. Even if you wanted to try and put sprinkler systems into those buildings, it'd be very difficult to get it into the upper areas where there's a lot of these voids and hidden areas because of just the height where they're at and just extreme fire load that's in those. This is old construction from hundreds of years ago where they didn't really worry about that type of stuff. You also have the masonry walls on the exteriors, and a lot of this timber work is holding up, is being held up by those walls. And once that timber starts burning up, those walls are probably going to come down also.
Yeah, that masonry structure that you say that surrounds the wood, it almost insulates the fire for a time, making it difficult, I would imagine, for firefighters to get to it and get to it quickly. Chief McGill, I appreciate you watching along with us as well. Again, the deputy mayor of Paris says Notre Dame Cathedral at this hour has already suffered, quote, colossal damages as we watch this play out live along with people all over the world. We know that hundreds of Parisians have lined the streets along the Seine and surrounding Notre Dame Cathedral, watching. Certainly devastated as they watch this historic church come down. The deputy mayor of Paris saying they fear that much more of this church will come down. Emmanuel Gregoire saying first responders are now trying to salvage the art and other priceless pieces that are stored in parts of that cathedral. Because so many of these cameras, and justifiably so, are pointed at the flames toward the top, it's hard to get a sense of that effort, but there are efforts on the ground to try to get some of the valuables and the historic historic pieces inside the church out of the cathedral, even as this fire takes place. There's significant concern on the ground because of reports that pieces of that church being carried away. One eyewitness describing the winds in Paris this evening, helping to fuel not only the flames, but then to carry the embers over parts of Paris. A concern for people watching from below. We saw earlier that spire, that famous spire at the top of the cathedral come down. It was initially surrounded by flames, and then we watched as this progressed on live television. There's the image right there, which is still breathtaking to see, and we've seen it several times now. But for a time, simply the flames were around the spire, and then you saw them shoot up right inside. And as we've heard so many people here eloquently describe the age and the historic nature of the lead and the wood, and the wood that was surrounded by much of the stone that builds the church, but now would serve as a bit of insulation as this fire takes over the top of the cathedral. And the main question now is how much of it can be saved, if any of it at all. We know that the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, is on the scene being briefed by authorities. He is trading one, national situation for another. He was set to address the French people about the growing divide, the socioeconomic debate within that country, the protests we've seen in the streets in recent months, the fires that have been set in the streets, set to address the nation tonight, in fact, and instead that speech put on hold, canceled for this evening, instead dealing with something that will bring heartbreak to everybody in France, and certainly prayers from around the world, including here in the U.S. President Trump tweeting as well his thoughts for the people of France, and certainly watching along with the rest of the world as that cathedral known by so many people. Even if you haven't been to Paris, people know Notre Dame Cathedral, and certainly in these days ahead, such a holy moment in the year and the calendar. Roman Catholics from all over the world set to mark Easter, and as we know, there was Sunday Mass in the Cathedral of Notre Dame every Sunday in Paris, and likely Mass was set for Easter a week from this weekend. Obviously, Good Friday coming up this weekend. I mentioned that tweet from President Trump, who wrote, "So horrible to watch, the massive fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris." He actually suggested water tankers or something from the air, and obviously we haven't seen any sort of aerial assault on this fire. We've only seen so far fire trucks from down below. There's the tweet from the president asking about whether or not water tankers could be used, must act quickly, he added to that tweet, and certainly they know on the ground there in Paris that they have to act and act rapidly. The question is whether or not they have that sort of capability in such a confined area in Paris. Chief McGill back with us now, and Chief, it must send, even for someone so experienced as yourself, shivers down the spine when you think about the age of this structure and what they're trying to preserve, and really they're just up against the clock at this point.
Structures like that, these antiquities, are very difficult to deal with. You want to be cognizant of the history behind them and try to save as much as you can while still trying to put the fire out. It's not an easy task to do. And as I'm watching it, water is going to be a big issue, trying to get water up there, especially to those heights. I saw the tweet from the president, but dropping water from a tanker, water is very heavy. And if it hits a structure like that out of a tanker, it could cause further collapse. And you're not going to be hitting the voids under the roof. Roofs are made to keep the water out, not let water in. So only parts where the roof is burned away would you get in there. But there's so many hidden voids in these old type structures that it's very difficult to get to them.
And the sheer weight of the water, Chief, as you point out, might be almost as damaging as the fire itself. Describe for us, if you will, the challenges as we now head into the evening, as we're watching here in the States, live coverage here on ABC News of the massive and devastating fire at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. It's about 8:47 in Paris at this hour. Nightfall, you can see the sky, not only from that billowing smoke, but the sky getting darker as we've been on the air here. And, Chief, how does that complicate things?
Well, anytime you start getting into the night hours in the PM, once you start losing sunlight, you start losing sight of most of the things you're trying to do. So it becomes a lot more difficult as it gets darker to try and figure out what's going on and where you want to place that water, and especially even when you're trying to get into the building if you can. Because right now, most of that building, I would assume, is a collapse hazard right now, except for the one section where the fire hasn't hit. But that's probably spreading into open voids inside that.
And when you think, Chief, about the valuables that we are told they are trying to save now from some of the storage areas inside the cathedral, that they're also in a race against time to do that. I mean, just the magnificent stained glass that we all know from being able to visit the cathedral during our reporting over the years in Paris, the sheer amount of beauty that they're hoping to at least try to save and have after this fire is done wreaking its havoc.
Yeah, and I'm sure the firefighters that are there, besides fighting these fires, are doing a heroic effort to try and get those valuables out of there. They're probably trying just as hard to get those out as they are putting this fire out. You know, you don't want to lose those type of items. There's such value to them.
Chief Stephen McGill, who is watching our live coverage along with us, much of the world watching as the Notre Dame Cathedral goes up in flames. The fire breaking out a couple of hours ago now, and at initial glance, you could see billowing smoke over the cathedral, and then the evolution of the size and the scope of what we were witnessing. There's scaffolding, and you can see it right there in that particular vantage point surrounding what was the spire of the cathedral. That's now been destroyed. This was part of a $7 million renovation project. They haven't confirmed tonight whether or not that's how this fire started, but obviously there is growing speculation that there was some sort of connection with the construction, the renovation underway at the cathedral. That spire has come down, and we know that much of the wooden interior of this 12th century landmark is burning and also likely to be destroyed. That spire coming down some time ago. There are predictions there on the scene that much of the roof of the cathedral is expected to go as well. People are watching as everything is burning. Nothing will remain, says the Notre Dame spokesman Andre Finot. And John Dickus, who is a professor in Paris, he's been living there for 2 years with his partner. You said she, not surprisingly, was in tears when she recognized the scope of this. And what are you seeing now as those skies grow dark and night falls on Paris?
So now that the sun has gone down, the fire looks a lot uglier. You can see all of the flames. You can see it sort of illuminating through the structure, which is sort of showing you how much of the structure is just gone. I mean, parts of it that have been there for centuries have collapsed, and we're just looking at the fire now. Which is horrifying to see. And you know, I was listening to you talk about some of the artifacts and relics are in there. I think about there's an item in there that many Christians believe is the actual crown of thorns. It's been there for close to 1,000 years now, and it's made of wood, right? And so when I think about some of the relics in there and how long they've been conserved, and it's got to be extremely difficult to try and get anything out of there at this point.
Really difficult, and as you know, because you're there, and for those of us who have seen the aerial views or been lucky enough to walk the streets of Paris, you know, it's located in a very finite piece of land right there in the center of Paris, this Gothic cathedral, and certainly among the most famous from the Middle Ages, and this 12th century cathedral, and Terry Moran mentioned earlier so eloquently, took the breath away of the people who likely were alive at the time to watch it go up, and certainly those who've been able to watch it survive so many tests along the way over the course of many centuries, and now, you know, it simply takes the breath away to watch what's transpiring in Paris tonight. And you can actually see the sky darkening now that we're into the evening hours in Paris as that flame shoots up right through the center of the church. And there's been a great focus as we've watched this unfold on the age of the structure and the fact that the wood that had been part of this structure that had been saved and preserved all of these years will also likely act as tinder and simply help fuel the fire as it makes its way through the church. There have been so many questions, and as this goes on through the afternoon here, hopefully we'll get some answers on the emergency response and the size and scope of it. In many of these views of the church in flames, you can only see a hose or two shooting water up onto the church. It would seem that they are vastly outnumbered by the size and scope of this fire. It certainly isn't a criticism, but simply an observation at this point that it seems that the response to this has not been obviously able to keep up with the scope of the flames as it takes aim at such an historic place of worship, known all over the world, but certainly the most famous cathedral in Paris, up in flames at this hour. You're watching ABC News live coverage, the Notre Dame Cathedral, the spire destroyed, much of the roof now destroyed. There are authorities in Paris now predicting much of the top of the cathedral will also collapse in the coming hours. And as you can see one of the hoses there in the foreground. It's unclear for those of us watching these live pictures the scope of the emergency response. There's also concern for people in the streets at this hour who are watching, praying, but watching and aghast along the Seine, the famous river that runs along the cathedral there in Paris. There's one lone firefighter in a bucket taking a look at the cathedral as it burns in front of really all of Paris. And when we say all of Paris, that includes the president, French President Emmanuel Macron, on the scene, being briefed. We saw him with the First Lady of France as well. And as I mentioned earlier, he was set to address the nation tonight, just not in this way. He was set to talk about the economy, the growing sort of social divide, the socioeconomic divide in that country, the social unrest after he became the leader of France. But instead tonight dealing with a disaster in the center of Paris, one of the best known cathedrals in the world. And if you look at the left, this is a new image. Wow, the scope of those flames as it sort of turns. Yeah, take a look at that again. That is the spire of the building coming down. And that's the historic structure known all over the world, and in the coming days would take on even added significance with Good Friday and Easter Sunday in the next week and a half. What a devastating sight, not only for Paris and for the people of France, but for those of us watching all over the world. Chief McGill, maybe you can give us a sense of how long firefighters on the scene are going to have to simply watch, keep people at bay, and try to do work around the perimeter, but in effect allow this to do what it's going to do.
Yeah, you know, there's such a large area. This is probably several blocks involved of this size structure. And the hardest thing for a chief on the scene, the incident commander, is going to be the command and control of all the firefighters that are there to make sure they're in safe areas, to account for them, to make sure nobody gets lost. You know, the amount of fire and the heavy timbers, there's a lot of fire load in there, very difficult to put out. This, I'm going to say, is probably going to be burning for hours, if not until the morning, before they make any headway on this.
Chief, thank you. And Chief McGill will continue to follow this as we follow with the rest of you at home, the burning of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And with every sort of vantage point comes sort of the new realization of just the level of destruction and devastation that they're witnessing firsthand. There's another one of the hoses trying to do what it can, but as Chief McGill points out, this is going to continue well into the evening hours. We're joined now on the phone by Chris Brimberg, who is one of the eyewitnesses there in Paris. And Chris, what can you tell us about what you're seeing right now?
Well, I've now returned home, but the sight on the banks of the Seine when I was on my way home from work were gobsmacking and heartbreaking. Groups of Parisians were standing on street corners in silence, actually, just listening to the timbers breaking into the cathedral. The tears were sort of being shed, and it really is quite heartbreaking. I was on my way home, on the way to the supermarket, and stopped in the left bank and saw the huge tower in the middle collapse with this crunching noise as it fell into the nave below.
I can only imagine that as you were traveling along the Seine that you were hardly alone, and people looking up in horror and the reality of what they're watching transpire with their own eyes, that this history, this grand history, right in the center of Paris is destroyed.
Hundreds of people, are sort of standing on the quays of the Seine. The army's moving them back into sort of side streets to allow the fire engines to get into the area. And I saw mobile fire trucks sort of setting up temporary offices on site. And they obviously think it's going to be a long operation there. I mean, it's hard to sort of underestimate how much this is part of Paris. all mileage comes from the centre of Paris, from in front of Notre Dame. So it's not only the spiritual centre of the city, it's the sort of geographical and cultural centre too. And so as I was walking home this evening, we were all standing on street corners talking to each other, going that the heart of our city is quite literally burning in front of us.
Chris Grinberg with us, describing what I had mentioned earlier, which is that this it really is the center of Paris. And for so many people who live, work, visit Paris, you know that the cathedral can be seen from so many parts of Paris, and people traveling home from work. So many travel right past it, and he described it perfectly, his travel home from work and how it takes him along the Seine and past the cathedral, and the horror of what he witnessed there today. For those of you watching us right now, you're watching live coverage of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, up in flames. This is from a time ago, and you can really tell, obviously, with the color or the shade of the sky in the background. We've now gone into the evening, about 9 o'clock Paris time. They're 6 hours ahead of us, so 3 p.m. Eastern here in New York. These are live pictures right now, so you can see that with nightfall, the scope and size of this fire has just become even more apparent. The flames growing as we've been on all afternoon. Initially, from several of the live feeds coming in from social media this afternoon, there was simply smoke surrounding the spire, the scaffolding that had surrounded the spire as well, part of the $7 million renovation project that had been underway. And then it soon became clear that firefighters were battling a massive blaze at the iconic Notre Dame Cathedral. It sent ash pouring onto tourists who were watching below. There were several reports of embers burning in the air, carried by the winds, a somewhat windy day in Paris, making it even worse. And Max Miaphitis, who's been kind enough to share not only his observations with us, but get a handle on what it is he's witnessing firsthand there in Paris. And I suppose, Max, that now that it's darker out, you're also seeing more clearly just how devastating this is.
Yeah, exactly. So what I can see right now is that the first tower is catching on flames. So, you know, from the cathedral, the front side, there is actually two huge towers, right? They are joined. Well, the left side of the tower is actually catching on fire, or we can see smoke coming up from it. And actually, the whole structure from the back is just burnt in flames. You cannot even see anything from it. It's like it's just red. It's a huge amount of flames everywhere. There's nothing else to say than just chaos. What's happening right now is really devastating, because we can see actually that like the firefighters are struggling to like keep down the fire. Like their water is just so small, like it's not doing anything. And we had we actually had the idea that we had planes coming up to shut it down, but how can you throw this huge amount of like water on a wood structure? It would destroy everything, right? So we just have to rely on these firefighters that are actually so close from the fire, but that cannot do anything at the moment. I don't know if you can hear it, but there is actually prayers very close to where I'm standing. People are actually, you know, like doing this in the memory of the cathedral, because she was there for so many years, and now she's just like disappearing behind a curtain of flames.
We can hear that in the background, your phone picking up the prayers of the people there in Paris tonight as they gather in the streets to watch what has been unfolding since about 6:50 p.m. local time. That would make it shortly before 1 p.m. Eastern. The first reports of a fire right in the center of Paris at the historic Notre Dame Cathedral. French media reporting at this hour several hundred firefighters are now on the scene, but as we just heard Max say, and we've heard Chief McGill say during our live coverage here on ABC, that it would be almost impossible to implement any sort of aerial assault with water over a structure that is this old, a 12th century cathedral, because it would simply destroy what's left. So much has been destroyed already. Authorities there on the scene have not only witnessed the spire come down, we just heard Max report that one of the towers is now engulfed in flames, and there have been predictions on the scene from local authorities that much more of this cathedral will come down in the hours ahead. We're joined by Kelly Weymouth, who we believe captured that video that left us speechless of the fire, is there on the scene. And we're watching your piece of video right now, and I don't even know how you were able to hold the phone, actually, while you were watching that through the lens of the phone, Kelly. I'm sorry you had to witness that, and just tell us what you've seen, what you're seeing now.
So me and my mom were going on a sunset cruise on the Seine, just like a champagne cruise. And when I got on the boat, someone had texted me. One of my friends texted me saying, Notre Dame is on fire. And we couldn't see it at that point. But we were kind of shaken up, and everyone was like, are you sure? Like, are you sure that's what's happening? And then our boat started going down the river, and you could see the smoke just raising up. And then eventually we got next to it, and you can just see the flames going up. And then the boat had to stop because they were stopping all traffic, but we had to stay in one spot. So we were actually next to Notre Dame for like 45 minutes just watching the fire. And eventually the tower came down. It was just very, very crazy.
Kelly, where are you from?
Washington, D.C.
From Washington, D.C., traveling through Paris with your mother with the holidays approaching? Yeah?
I'm studying abroad here this semester, and she's visiting me this week.
Must be a chilling thing to witness, obviously, with your mother. And how many other people were on that sunset cruise? We know that it's such a popular thing to do there on the Seine in Paris, and setting out on what you thought would be, you know, an enjoyable and somewhat romantic. It's impossible for it not to be a romantic evening in Paris until you begin witnessing what you have witnessed.
There were like 40 of us maybe, and it was just kind of crazy because there was people from all different countries. Then eventually there were some French people on there, and they just started sobbing and holding each other, and it was just very, very intense.
Well, Kelly, please send our best to your mother as well, and to the folks who were on that cruise. Will be forever changed by what they witnessed this afternoon. Kelly, thank you, and thank you for sharing your images.
Thank you.
As devastating as they are. That's Kelly Weymouth on the phone. She was doing one of those sunset cruises on the Seine. She's studying abroad, and her mother was there visiting her. She said she was on the cruise with so many other people, and what was, I thought, most notable about what she offered to us was the description of the French people who were on that sunset cruise with her, weeping, watching a piece of history destroyed in front of their eyes. And we saw Kelly capturing the moment the spire came down, and this was handed to me a moment ago. The French writer and historian Camille Pascal was on French media a short time ago and was describing the massive fire at Notre Dame, and she said it's caused the destruction of invaluable heritage, and we can be only horrified by what we see. 800 years since the cathedral has begun watching over Paris, as she pointed out, and its bells pealed for both happy and unfortunate events. So much of the history of France has been witnessed by that edifice, that enormous cathedral, that beauty that soars into the sky. And we were listening to Max earlier describe the prayers, and we've even had reports of some singing, and people on the scene there. You can hear it right there. Just the general unrest in the streets of Paris. There were reports that emergency teams at first were actually slowed down in their effort to get to that small little patch of land where the cathedral stands across the Seine, by just the sheer amount of people who were watching in horror and disbelief. And these are the people who live there in Paris, the Parisians, but also people visiting France. You know, Kelly Weymouth, who we were just talking with, who captured that unbelievable piece of video. She's there studying abroad for the semester. Her mother had come to visit. We listened to John Dickus with us all afternoon here. He's still with us now. He was the professor who has been living in Paris with his partner. He told us earlier that she was in tears when she realized the scope of what it was you were watching unfold. And I'm curious, John, what it all looks like now that the skies have turned dark and the sun has gone down in Paris.
Yeah, absolutely. The fire has gotten a bit smaller. We can see they finally are getting some water on what looks like the center of the cathedral, which is encouraging. But as the sky's gotten dark, the fire just looks so much more sinister, and you can see how much of the cathedral is gone already. I mean, we can see through sections that have been there for centuries that just aren't there anymore, and it's devastating to see. Just a minute ago at 9 o'clock, the Eiffel Tower started sparkling, which it does at the top of every hour, and that just made for a surreal and unsettling scene to see the Eiffel Tower sparkling as Notre Dame burned along the skyline next to it. Down on the streets have cleared. Rush hour is over now, so vehicles are able to get through again. But the sidewalks are, particularly on the bridge in front of my house, are still packed with Parisians who just can't believe what they're looking at. It's just devastating.
But you mentioned, John, that you thought the scope of the fire seems somewhat smaller than what you were watching earlier.
No question. The fire has gotten a lot smaller, but the horrible reason for that is a lot of the cathedral is gone. I mean, there's just less cathedral to burn than there was when it started 2 hours ago, and so there's no question that the fire is lower than it was when it first started. The tops of the two towers, the two big stone towers at the front of the cathedral have not burned at any point in the last 2 hours. We haven't seen any flames come up to the top of those, so we're holding out hope that those will be there when this is done. And we can see there's still the hoses look so small compared to the flames that we still see leaping out of the cathedral, but at least now we can see they've got one that's aiming right at the center, and that's giving us a little bit of encouragement as well.
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, John, as you were pointing out that the flames seem somewhat smaller than where they were at their peak within the last hour. And part of that, as John Dickus points out, is likely because much of the cathedral has now collapsed and crumbled under the weight and scope of this massive blaze at the top of Notre Dame Cathedral. And so while the scope of the fire might be marginally smaller than what it was, it likely reflects more of the cathedral being destroyed forever. He did mention that the towers that he's looking at are not engulfed, and there is hope on the streets of Paris and for the people who are watching this, certainly in their own nation, the live coverage of it there. They're hoping beyond hope that much of this cathedral, whatever you can see still standing, will be saved. But I want to bring in Chief McGill because, Chief, there have been so many questions as people watch this live coverage about the scope of the response, and it was perfectly put earlier when you described the challenge of trying to knock down a blaze with something so old, so storied, and we're talking about a cathedral from the 12th century. You can't hit it with an aerial assault because you'll simply speed up the destruction of the cathedral.
Yeah, and there's a heavy fire load in there, like I said, heavy timbers. It's almost like trying to put a forest fire with a roof out with a roof on top of it. Obviously now the roof is burnt away, but you have a lot of that scaffolding around there. You need a tremendous amount of water to fight this type of fire. And I see a couple of tower ladders that are up. You'd probably need 5 or 10 times as many to put a dent into this fire. Your other biggest concern is, for the firefighters there, is the collapse potential. Because these buildings are so high, you have to set up a collapse zone, and you're worried about something collapsing that's maybe 5 stories high. You have to be 10 stories high away, basically. You have to double that height to be in a safe area. So they can only get those hose lines so close to that building without putting themselves in danger. And it looks like they are. They're doing a great job. It looks like most of the building where the fire started is burnt away where the scaffolding is. They probably cut it off right before it got to those towers. So those towers are probably going to be safe from my perspective anyway. I'm sure that's what they're doing now, is just fighting from the towers towards that main body of fire by the scaffolding.
And simply doing this by surrounding the cathedral, is that correct, Chief? And we're seeing a couple of these shots with the hoses pointed obviously right toward that scaffolding that you described, but that seems to be how they're tackling this fire, is simply not only from the ground, but by trying to surround the cathedral.
Yeah, the common terminology is surround and drown. It's basically you're doing a defensive operation because it's much too dangerous to have firefighters inside that building, inside that collapse zone. So where that main body of fire is, they're hitting it from a distance away. And most of the time it's going to be from the outside in a structure like this. However, there may be firefighters inside on the parts where it isn't burned, and they're fighting from the unburned side towards that fire to keep it from spreading towards that other part of the building. Looks like they're doing a really good job of protecting those other structures, but it's very difficult, and they're working in a hazardous condition. And at any given time, my thing I'm looking at is those scaffolding. The scaffolding is very weak. That's probably going to collapse, and hopefully there's nobody under there or in that area.
It's somewhat surprising, Chief, that the scaffolding has lasted this long.
Yeah, I'm very surprised. I don't know how that scaffolding was set up. I mean, scaffolding is usually pretty rigid, but a lot of times it's also attached to the building, so the building gives it some support. Now, without that building there, it's just supporting itself. And with that heavy volume of fire around there, I'd be very surprised if it stays up.
Chief Stephen McGill and our live coverage here on ABC of the fire raging at the cathedral, the Notre Dame Cathedral, right in the heart of Paris this afternoon. It's now almost coming up on, well, 3:15 Eastern time, which of course means 8:15 there in Paris. You can see the sky behind the cathedral now dark as Parisians in the streets pray for their cathedral. Many of them, the rush hour, as we heard a moment ago from one of our eyewitnesses, is over. Many people have retreated to their homes and are likely watching just as we are here in the States as their beloved cathedral goes up in flames. We're joined now by Simon Jones. Simon's another eyewitness who watched much of this as it unfolded there in Paris. And Simon, what did you see?
I just saw that the roof was on fire and there was just loads of people standing around. Just as far as you could see, the streets were packed with people openly crying and weeping, and it was just a very somber, quiet atmosphere. You can hear me, the church bells are tolling in other local churches around the city. I watched the spire collapse down into the roof, and then slowly the roof collapsed. And at that point, like quite a few people, I just had to turn and walk away. It was truly awful, awful sight.
Just a devastating sight, and we know the role that the cathedral has played over the course of history, sort of a, a calming presence that cathedral has had, even in times of horror and in times of terror, most recently in the terror attacks that struck Paris back in 2015, the bells sounding a death knell after that November 2015 terror attack. Authorities are right now, even as they try to knock down this fire, are investigating whether or not that renovation work on the cathedral, and in particular the lead, the 250 tons of lead that make up that church and the spire on the top of the church, the renovation that was underway. It's about a $7 million renovation project at last word. Whether or not somebody working construction on that project might have ignited or started the fire, that's unknown. We do know that in the last couple of days, 16 religious statues were actually removed from the peak. And that was the first time that happened in more than a century, and they were removed to be taken away to be cleaned. They did obviously escape the blaze. As we know, there's also a secondary effort, which hopefully with more time that passes, we'll be able to see of teams on the ground trying to get artifacts that are in different parts of that cathedral out of the cathedral to try to save them. There is a statement from Cardinal Dolan here in the U.S. on the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. He said, quote, "I just went next door to our own beloved cathedral, St. Patrick's, to ask the intercession of Notre Dame, Our Lady, for the cathedral at the heart of Paris and of civilization now in flames. God preserve this splendid house of prayer and protect those battling the blaze." That from Cardinal Dolan just a short time ago, praying for the cathedral from our own St. Patrick's Cathedral here in New York, and he too hoping that there will be no injuries. And we have not heard any reports of injuries as of yet. We know there were a number of workers who were on this project when these flames began to break out, getting them down, and there's the spire coming down. And no matter how many times we've watched this play out, one of the witnesses that we were talking to earlier, her name was Kelly Weymouth, and she described the quintessential sort of American experience in Paris. She's there studying abroad, lucky enough to escape for a semester to study the great rich history that Paris offers, and her mother was there visiting. She said they were taking a sunset cruise on the Seine when they looked up, saw the fire, and this is her video that you're looking at right now. She held that phone steady, which I'm not sure I could have done as we were witnessing all of this as we were on with live coverage. Again, the fire breaking out, for those of you who have joined us in progress, the fire breaking out at about 6:50 Paris time. That would make it shortly before 1 p.m. Eastern here in America. We know several hundred firefighters are on the scene. We've been talking with Chief McGill and a number of other witnesses who've talked about the sheer challenge in trying to knock down a fire at a cathedral that was first built in the 12th century. It's been damaged along the way in the French Revolution, post-World War II. It's been rebuilt, renovated several times, but this perhaps will be its biggest test yet. The massive blaze that has been churning and doing its work on the top of the cathedral, and certainly the spire isn't the only thing damaged. There were predictions on the ground that the entire roof would come in. There have been some witnesses who have told us that in fact has happened, that the entire roof has burned. There's also been a lot of talk about the danger when you are working a construction project, a renovation project on a piece of history so storied and so old. We're getting word now that they're on social media, and we always use caution when there are reports coming in from social media, though it is a valuable tool in this day and age, as we've seen with the images that came in almost immediately that signaled there was perhaps a real horror that was playing out at one of the most historic sites in the world, which got us on the air fairly quickly. And now there are reports from social media, and again, they're not confirmed, but we can join John Dickus. John, are you still with us? Or Max. If Max is with us, or John apparently is with us. He's the American professor with us. And I want to get to these reports on social media because it's impossible, obviously, for us on this end to confirm them. But there are reports that the towers are either very close to being on fire or are on fire. But you, perhaps, from your vantage point, can give us a clearer picture.
Yeah, I thankfully I can see the two towers, and that's not accurate. The two towers from where I'm standing, there's no flames coming out of them. They are not in danger of collapsing. They haven't moved. Very tragically, the reason I can see the towers so well is that the roof of the cathedral is gone. It's no longer obstructing my view of the towers at all, so I can see them very clearly because the roof has completely collapsed.
So from your vantage point, the tower is not on fire. We know the AP had tentatively reported that it had spread to one of the church's landmark rectangular towers, but from where you are, you don't see flames spreading beyond the roof itself, which is now collapsed in. You've seen that for yourself, and the spire. And of course, it's very difficult now that we see nightfall in Paris to see just how much of the church is completely destroyed. What is easier to see is just the scope of the flames. And Max Miafaitis was another one of our eyewitnesses who helped us earlier, told us that one thing you can see now, because the sky has darkened, is that the flames themselves have reduced in size, though that could also be an indication that what they were consuming has simply collapsed inside the cathedral. And so it's also a sign of increasing damage. John, we're looking at pictures that you took just a short time ago, and you know, the difference between this image right here of the sky and the smoke, which is what we saw early on, and now with the darkened sky over much of Paris, those flames shooting up into the sky.
Yeah, it's horrifying, and the smoke has cleared now. There was very heavy smoke, huge columns and clouds of smoke 2 hours ago, and while that smoke was coming out of the cathedral, it was very hard to see how much damage there had been. It was just great volumes of smoke coming off and sort of, you know, towering over the city. And now that the smoke has thinned out quite a bit, I can see I'm on the 6th floor, so I'm looking straight at the level of where the base of the spire was 2 hours ago. And I can see the interior of the church is just gutted. I mean, the fire has clearly gotten smaller, but it's because it looks like both the nave and the transept have been completely devastated by the flames.
John Dickus, a professor there in Paris, living there, calling Paris his home for the last couple of years, and offering a difficult description for those of you joining us for our live coverage, saying that he can see into the church, that the roof is destroyed, that much of the inside of the church is destroyed. We saw the spire come down some time ago, and you know, in the reporting that's come out in these hours that we've been on the air, there are a number of people pointing to construction work, renovations, and sort of a long and somewhat checkered history with these historic churches, cathedrals, synagogues that are renovated. It can often be a dangerous combination. You know, one of the reasons they point to, you know, open flames from torches or from welders, other hazards on the scaffolding coming very close to these ancient parts of these cathedrals. You know, Notre Dame's wooden roof, and the materials are so high up and difficult to reach. Obviously, if it does spark a fire, and we've watched that play out right in front of our eyes, there were so many questions early on, including a question from President Trump asking perhaps why flying water tankers couldn't be used to put it out. He actually tweeted, "Must act quickly." Then over the course of time, we had our fire chief on the air and a number of people there on the ground in France talking about how that simply wouldn't work because of the sheer weight of the water coming down on something so old. But those are just some of the challenges that are faced not only by the firefighters who are now tasked with trying to knock down these flames, and as we heard from the chief there earlier, that the entire cathedral likely surrounded. We're joined now by, Mark, give me that again. Billy Stapleton, he's from the ATF. And Billy, I know that you've been watching this along with Chief McGill, and I appreciate you taking the time for us. And if you could just add to what Chief McGill told us earlier, which is was extraordinarily helpful in describing why it is so difficult to try to knock down a fire in a structure that is this old.
Yeah, well, this type of structure is undoubtedly constructed with heavy timber construction on the interior to provide a skeleton for the outer walls. This heavy timber is very strong when it's in the condition that was meant to be at the time of construction. Over time, it can deteriorate. It can be more prone to collapse, especially with fire impinging upon the roof system. And it's a large structure. It's difficult to get enough water into the structure.
Billy Stapleton with the ATF watching this with us. It's now 3:23. 9:23 there in Paris, and that quote that sent shivers earlier, quote, "Everything is burning, nothing will remain from the frame," and that came from André Finot. He told the French media there. He's the spokesman for Notre Dame, and as we know, this cathedral, built in the 12th century, is home to incalculable works of art. We know that there is an effort underway on the ground to try to save much of that art. We also know that that in the coming days, with Good Friday approaching and Easter Sunday approaching, that so many people from around the world make that trip to Notre Dame. It's still used. They still conduct Mass on Sundays. That did not stop with this renovation project. And as we heard earlier, the Americans who were on that sunset cruise down the Seine looking up in disbelief at what they were witnessing. That was right about the time that we came on the air when we saw that spire fully engulfed with flames and knew it was just a matter of time, and then watched it collapse with all of you at home. I want to bring in Terry Moran and this notion. This is Kelly Weymouth's video here, Terry. That was the young American woman who's studying in France. And you and I were talking earlier just about, you know, the storied history of the cathedral. The cathedral right in the center of Paris has been a reassuring place, not only of worship, but because of what it has symbolized for the people of Paris, and that it has survived so many tests before.
You're absolutely right, David. That cathedral is the heart of Paris, built on an island right in the middle of the river that runs through the middle of Paris. It's the heart of French Christianity. It's the heart of the French nation and the French people. And it has seen over these centuries so many crucial moments of the history of the French people. One thinks of the liberation of Paris. We were talking about it earlier, which culminated in this incredibly dramatic moment when Charles de Gaulle arrived at Notre Dame. It was the first place he wanted to go in Paris, and a gun battle broke out, symbolizing the struggle of Paris and France itself during World War II, all the way back to the French Revolution, where the revolution became very radicalized and decided that France should no longer be a Christian country, and they targeted the cathedral there. They targeted Notre Dame for vandalism and desecration. Each time it has risen from the destruction and from the challenges and the wars. And this is going to be another huge challenge. You know, it'll be a very different cathedral that rises out of the ashes, and rise it will. But we don't know, of course, who the architects and artists were that built that 800 years ago. They weren't star celebrity architects. They were not building a showpiece. They were building a giant prayer in stone and timber and glass. And my hunch is that Christians all over the world will give not just money but beautiful artifacts. Its rising will be an expression of the abiding power of the Christian faith to so many millions of people around the world. As we watch these tragic scenes, I think we can look forward to a great project of faith for the people of France and for people around the world as well.
Terry Moran offering some hope with these holy days ahead of us, and Christians around the world preparing to mark those holy days, and so often coming from all over the world to visit the cathedral, the Notre Dame Cathedral. And as we mentioned earlier, and as Terry just pointed out, the real challenge will be in moving forward. Who will rebuild? Who will be chosen? Who will contribute? And certainly a lot of responsibility will be on the shoulders of the French president, who has tried to calm his nation amid the protests in recent months, the yellow vest crisis that has rocked the country, the economic uncertainty in that country. In many ways, one of the debates there has been a similar debate that we've seen here in the U.S., which is about a shrinking middle class and about economic disparity. But tonight, on a night when he was supposed to address the nation, that has been canceled. He instead will likely be addressing the nation about something vastly different, the more immediate heartbreak in their country, that right in the center of Paris, the heart of Paris, the cathedral, the Notre Dame Cathedral, going up in flames shortly before 1 p.m. Eastern, a construction project on the spire of the church, a renovation project at the church, believed to be perhaps a contributing factor to this fire, though that's not been confirmed. No reports, and this is the one part of the good news in this, no reports of any injuries as of yet. And of course, we await to hear how successful they were in trying to salvage some of the jewels, some of the art, some of the history from inside that cathedral. John Dickus, an American who's teaching in Paris, I want to get a final word from you. You've been so thoughtful and so calm as you and your partner, you described her tears earlier, as you witnessed this from your vantage point, seeing the true destruction firsthand.
Sure. You think about how long this cathedral has been here and what it's meant to so many people, both residents of Paris and visitors to Paris from around the world. Obviously Christians who see it as a house of worship, but also people of all faiths who see it as just this beautiful and timeless work of art and architecture and such just an iconic part of the city. And it's just been gut-wrenching over the last couple hours to watch it come down. And from where I'm standing on my balcony now, I can see that the fire is a lot smaller. It's a lot smaller than it was an hour ago. But the reason I can see that so clearly is because so much of this church is just missing. There's just so much of it that isn't there anymore, and it is not going to be there anytime soon.
John Dickus, an American who is living in Paris, who has lived there for the last couple of years, who teaches there on a balcony and helping to navigate us through our coverage through the course of the afternoon, reporting there a moment ago that the world-famous 12th century monument that is engulfed in flames, that those flames, it would appear, according to John, or at least from his vantage point, that they're reduced somewhat in size, but he also added the fact that likely that means that they simply destroyed what they had engulfed in the moment. The roof has caved in. He can see that from where he is, and perhaps the fact that we're not seeing as many of the flames as we saw earlier simply means they have destroyed what they were working on. And now we wait in the coming hours to see if the fire spreads, if the containment. We do know that firefighters are surrounding the cathedral on the ground. That there was not an aerial assault of any kind because of the sheer age of that cathedral, but that they're working to contain, surround, and contain, which is what we heard from the fire chief earlier. And they will likely do that into the coming hours. And now the young French president has a new challenge on his hands, which is to help his nation deal with the loss of a structure known all over the world, and has certainly given them something to look to in times of a test and heartbreak, and tonight that heartbreak surrounds the cathedral itself. Our thanks to Terry Moran and to James Longman, our foreign correspondent, to the fire chief, and to so many of the eyewitnesses who were so thoughtful on the scene, to Max, to John, Kelly Weymouth, that student with her mother on the Seine. I'm David Muir. We'll have complete team coverage on World News Tonight. Our live coverage continues at ABC News Live and at abcnews.com. I'll see you in a short time from now. Until then, good day.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kimberly Brooks. coming to you from ABC News Live. We're continuing coverage of some breaking news, some devastating news out of Paris. One of the city's most popular attractions, perhaps the most iconic cathedral in the world, the Notre Dame, is in flames. It has been burning for the last 2.5 hours. It started at around 6:50 p.m. Paris time and hasn't stopped since. So I want to go right now to Terry Moran, who's in our D.C. bureau. Terry, are you there? I just want to just talk about the cultural impact that this would have on the Parisian people and people all over the world.
Well, people all over the world, let's start with that. While this tragedy has been unfolding, my wife sent me a picture of our pose in front of Notre Dame, and there are millions upon millions of people around the world who went to that place and loved it, found love there, some of them, no doubt. It is a magical place in a wonderful city. And so I think there's a personal connection that so many people around the world who have had the opportunity to go to Paris have, because it's the heart of that city, as you point out. And this is a heartbreak for the city of Paris and for the French people. It's a symbol of the nation. You know, I was looking at the fire, and we were hearing reports of firefighters trying to go in to preserve some of the treasures inside the cathedral, risking their lives as there's timber and stone and lead falling from the heights of that soaring cathedral. Among those treasures is the Virgin of Paris, it's called. A statue, if you walk into the cathedral, is off to the left along one of the columns. That 14th century statue that represented not just the way the Virgin Mary loved her son, Jesus, but the way that the Virgin and God loved Paris. It had become a symbol of Paris itself, and that is undoubtedly one of the things they'll try to get. It's impossible to state the significance of this structure and this place of worship to the people of Paris and France, and one's heart goes out to them. It is a building. It is, so far as we understand, and thank God, literally, there are reports of no fatalities, but it is a heartbreak nevertheless for the people of France and Paris in particular.
Yeah, and one of the most devastating images that we saw earlier was the entire spire coming down. So I want to go to Lucy Weymouth. She is actually the mother of a student who was over there on study abroad. Lucy, are you there? I just want to hear what your experience was like when you saw that fall down.
Yeah, it was just amazing. We were on a cruise on the Seine, and as soon as we got on the boat, we could see the smoke in the distance, but the boat took off anyway. And as we came around the corner, I mean, it was just up in flames. And then they stopped the traffic on the river, and our boat was stopped right in front of the cathedral. So we ended up getting that footage of the spire coming down, and you know, everybody on the boat obviously was very upset, and but we just sat there and watched it come down. And right now we're still here looking at what's left of it, and there's kind of a vigil going on here, thousands of people just looking at what you can see that's left of it.
And how has the fire changed from the daytime, because now in Paris it's actually nighttime? So has the fire lessened, or what does it look like now?
Yeah, it looks like it's almost out. I mean, there's still parts of it that are on fire, but it's all lit up kind of from the inside where the fire is still going on. And from where we are, you can kind of see through. There's a very large window at the end where we are, and you can just see through the window and of the cathedral and over to where it's just kind of embers over there. There's just one end of it is still here, but it looks like it's pretty much gutted on the inside.
And what was your daughter, Kelly, that's your daughter, what was her response to seeing this? Because was this her first time in Paris? She was studying abroad?
Yeah, she's been here all semester studying, and I just came a few days ago to visit her, and we were actually at the cathedral yesterday. We toured it. So it was just kind of surreal to see something like that happen just the day after we were inside of the cathedral.
This actual spire, they're saying it's not confirmed, but that there was a $7 million renovation going on that may have been the origin of this fire. So I want to go to John Dickus, who's an American who's teaching in Paris. John, what was the experience like for you?
It was horrifying. I mean, watching this, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world burning down in front of you is just a gut-wrenching experience. I first noticed that something was going on because the bridge in front of my house started filling up with pedestrians who were looking across the river and looked like they were just shocked. So I went out onto my balcony and I could see that the roof had started to burn. And initially, it was small enough that we were hoping that it would get under control somehow. It took about 20 to 30 minutes before the flames spread to the point where there was clearly going to be no turning back, and then there was just going to be devastating damage done to the cathedral.
Wow. And the fire now, with it in the nighttime, it looks like it's contained, or does it look like the flame's still pretty large?
The fire is certainly smaller than it was, but the horrible thing is the reason it's gotten smaller is that there's a lot of the cathedral is gone. It's burned and it's not there anymore. And so you can see the fire much more clearly, and you can see it's certainly smaller than it was an hour ago, and they seem to be able to get water more directly on it than they could for a long time. But the roof of the cathedral is gone. You can see the transept and the nave are both just gutted. And so the two prominent rectangular towers at the front of the cathedral seem to have held up fairly well. We haven't seen any flames coming out of them or going up them at all night. But the rest of the cathedral interior, it's horrifying what's happened over there.
All right, yeah, so pretty devastating to see the images. And the president, French President Emmanuel Macron, he tweeted earlier, he said, "Our Lady," which the Notre Dame is referred to as, "Our Lady of Paris is in flames, emotion of a whole nation, thought for all Catholics and for all French. Like our countrymen, I'm sad tonight to see this part of us burn." So I want to go to James Longman, who's in our London bureau. James, can you just give me an idea of how the French people are reacting to this? This is basically the heart of the French nation.
Well, just with devastation. I think one of the officials in charge of heritage at Notre Dame tweeted, and I think it sums it up, "A close friend is leaving us tonight." And I think for me that really hit home. Terry spoke earlier about how important this building is to the French, not just a symbol of its religious history, but the fact, because for me, France is fiercely a secular state. It talks a lot about how proud it is to be a secular state, but it is cognizant of its religious history as well. And I think the beauty about Notre Dame is you don't have to be religious to appreciate it and love it. And I was there just a couple of months ago. I went inside and lit a candle for my grandmother, who was a very, very strong Catholic. And that's the kind of thing that all Parisians do. And that's why this place means so much to them. Because, yes, it's a symbol of France's religious history, but also, I suppose, just a symbol of Parisian life and just a symbol of the city itself and just how much it's withstood. It's withstood basically everything that history has thrown at Paris over hundreds and hundreds of years, and to see this tonight is absolutely astounding. Messages of support are coming in from around the world, including, amazingly, from UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. We're used to hearing messages of support from them when places of architectural and archaeological and historical importance are under threat in war zones. But tonight they're saying that they're ready to stand, they're standing by France, ready to help rebuild Notre Dame as and when that process begins. But yeah, you asked about just how important this is to Paris. Just outside the front gates of Notre Dame, there's a brass plate, and what that place is it's a place which marks basically all distances from Paris. All locations around France are measured from that place, and tourists flock there. You can spin around on it, and if you land in front of your lover and you kiss them, then that's good luck. You flick coins for good luck, just like a wishing well. There is just so much cultural importance in this place, and I think all French people are watching with horror tonight, particularly at the beginning, well, right in the middle of a very important religious week. The Lenten celebrations in Notre Dame are some of the most well-known in the world. It's one thing that cathedral is really, really well known for, and so the French are now going to have to decide where else in Paris they might be able to hold their Easter celebrations. Saint-Sulpice is another massive cathedral, about the same sort of size in Paris, so it might be that they transfer some of the celebrations there. But I mean, we heard someone earlier on just explain to us that he saw the Eiffel Tower lit up with sparkles, because it does that on the hour, every hour, and across on the horizon they saw Notre Dame burning, and that contrast is quite a thing to imagine. France is not going to get over this quickly at all. It's going to take decades to rebuild this building by the looks of things. I am not an expert, but you don't need an expert to see just how much devastation this fire has wrought on that building. It's truly an incredible thing to watch.
Yeah, and James, you mentioned the start of Holy Week. It's actually the busiest week in Paris, and nearly 13 or 14 million people visit a year. So I want to go to Donia Hamoni. She's actually a tourist that's in Paris right now. Donia, can you just describe what it's like on the ground there where you are?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm actually not a tourist. I've been living in Paris for around 7 years, but a Dutch national, and I pass the Notre Dame every day. It's almost in my backyard. And as some of the other speakers have already said, it's really at the heart, both in a symbolic way as well as a geographical way, of Paris. And when I was walking up there, it was going up in flames. The roof was collapsing, which gave further ammunition to the flames. And everyone was just crying, emotional, in shock, and trying to figure out what the fire department was doing to actually control the fire. Initially, it looked like very little, but I understand it's actually very difficult to control a fire of this magnitude with such an old building. But yeah, the fire department is just actually one block up, and there's water all around in Notre Dame, obviously. So people were thinking, why is no one really controlling this fire? And it got worse and worse to the extent that the towers themselves were really at risk. Yeah, it's crazy. Yesterday I was walking by, and the trees were in blossom, and everyone was, just enjoying the street musicians just in front of the Notre Dame, enjoying Parisian lifestyle with the Notre Dame. And I think we all are taking it for granted, despite the fact, of course, that we all are very, very, very much aware of what a historic building this is and what a symbol and inspiration it has been throughout Europe, throughout the ages, also from a construction point of view and from an art history point of view. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen now. We'll see. I hope it don't completely collapse it. But yeah, fingers crossed, and saying a little prayer despite the fact that I'm not religious.
Yeah, we had saw earlier where there were just a few firefighters working on it, and then hundreds more showed up. Donald Trump even tweeted, President Trump, he said, "So horrible to watch the massive fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Perhaps flying water tankers could be used to put it out. Must act quickly." But in our coverage earlier, we were learning that pouring water on such an old structure could actually make it worse. I want to go back to Terry Moran. Terry, just talk about, this is a building that was constructed in the 12th century, but it's been damaged and renovated many different times.
It has. It's seen a lot of history. This night is one of its darker nights, but there's no question that Notre Dame, which rose like a kind of miracle in the heart of Paris, no building like it had ever been seen, certainly in the West. It was an architectural innovation, those famous flying buttresses which allowed the roof to be raised to such a great height, and is now, of course, collapsed in this fire, were an amazement to people. And over the years, it had seen violence and war and plague, and Hitler famously toured it. And then later, when he was losing the war, as the Germans were retreating from Paris, Hitler gave the order for the whole city to be destroyed, including the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The German general in charge disobeyed that order, and that's why it survives. But it has seen so much history and continued to rise. And James is absolutely right. It stands for something, of course, for all people of the Christian faith. I went to Mass there, weekday Mass, ordinarily weekday Mass, a few years back, and one couldn't help but feel that one's own prayers were being lifted along with countless millions down through the centuries. It's a very special experience. But for all people, it represents a kind of peak of civilization. Somebody once said that term, civilization, what does it mean to be civilized? It's very difficult to describe. But this guy said, when I stand in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, I know what it means. And I think that is that emotional connection that it has to all people who feel human aspiration in so many ways, see it in Notre Dame and Notre Dame. And that's one of the things that I think is a challenge for people around the world. It's why it's so heartbreaking. You go on Twitter, on social media, you can feel the emotion that people have watching this symbol of what people are capable of in our better moments, facing one of its darkest nights.
Yeah, so yeah, I saw on Twitter where people were describing it as a cultural tragedy. And the president, he was set to talk to the nation tonight, but now he has to address this very horrific tragedy. So, James, I want to come back to you. I want to get an idea of what the French media has been saying. Maybe we can listen in and you can translate for us so we have an idea.
Vatican réagit également, incrédulité et tristesse. C'est un communiqué qui nous est parvenu il y a quelques minutes.
Et on a aperçu les pompiers qui ont pris position sur les tours pour tenter d'en finir avec l'incendie qui s'est répandu, qui est parti, on vous le rappelle, hein, du cœur de la cathédrale et qui s'est propagé, qui est maintenant dans les tours, qui
They are looking at the possibility of the flames approaching the towers. Now, they're talking about those two towers in front of Notre Dame. They're very famous, the twin towers, if you like. They hold the bell tower, and so there's a discussion about whether or not it could get close to those towers. There is discussion about a request amongst the priests of France Paris to start ringing their bells in prayer. We heard earlier people assembled outside of Notre Dame, of course, praying for the building, and that is a discussion that's going on here. We're now in an interview with a local official talking about how trying to get other churches to ring their bells to kind of witness this tragedy.
Oui, vous savez, moi, avant d'être le secrétaire général et le porte-parole de la Conférence des évêques de France, je suis prêtre du diocèse de Paris.
They're talking now to a former French priest.
De ce diocèse avec notre archevêque, une immense.
And he's a spokesperson for the bishopric, and saying that they are absolutely devastated by the fire in this building, and particularly because it's during the Easter week.
C'est parce que nous croyons que l'Église n'est pas composée de pierres uniquement, mais de pierres vivantes que sont les croyants.
They say that the building isn't only built of stones, it's built of living stones that are believing stones. Sorry, that's a poor translation, but basically what he's saying is it's a religious building in its very essence, and to watch it burn like this is devastating.
Mais il ne s'agit pas d'optimisme, il s'agit d'espérance. Et donc c'est de dire
he says he's not an optimist, but he has hope. And he has only to hope that this building will survive, because this building is not made of stone, it's made of living prayer.
Pour l'histoire de notre pays, tant d'événements y ont été célébrés, elle dépasse largement le cadre des catholiques. Et en même temps, c'est un lieu si important pour les catholiques de notre diocèse, du diocèse de Paris.
It isn't just an important place for Catholics, it's an important place for all of France.
Nous espérons que quelque chose pourra être sauvé de la cathédrale, qu'elle pourra être reconstruite.
And obviously saying that they hope that the cathedral, something of the cathedral, can be saved.
Et la France n'entend non plus cette sonnerie des cloches.
Merci beaucoup, Olivier.
And hoping that France will once again hear the bells ringing in Notre Dame.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about the restoration. I saw some people already beginning to talk about it being restored. What do you think of that? Like, is it something that can be done? Can it be salvaged? Of course, some of the artifacts and some of the pieces inside, but can the whole building be restored like it was before?
You've got to hope so, Kimberly. I mean, what we're watching here is mostly the timber burning. Now, as much of a tragedy as that is, you would like to hope that the stones, the main structure of the building, will survive the fire. You haven't got to look at fires, similar fires in other historical buildings and see what's been done afterwards. And we in the UK are reminded of a massive fire at Windsor Castle, which people will know as being the place, of course, where the Queen lives and where Harry and Meghan were married last year. Well, in 1992, there was an enormous fire there. It ended up being around $50 million worth of damage. A chapel was destroyed. A lot of the Queen's own personal belongings were taken, St. George's Chapel there. So there was an enormous amount of destruction, and the pictures were extraordinary. We watched as basically the Queen, huddled in a field, watched as her building burned. And it was very sad for this country. A piece of our history, a piece of our cultural history, and a piece of our identity burning before our eyes. And yet now it's crowning glory, literally, and it's an extraordinary place, and it was totally it was totally saved. So you've got to hope the same thing will happen here in Notre Dame. As we watch, people around the world will be watching. Catholics, but many others will want to donate as much as they can. We've already heard from the United Nations that they stand ready to help France in its restoration project. It will be costly. It will take many years. Don't forget, this building took about 100 years to build in the first place. But I wonder, and it's difficult to say, I'm not excited to see what happens next, because obviously this is very sad, but I can well imagine that the French will coalesce around a new and very beautiful Notre Dame at some stage in the future. The French have this extraordinary ability to rally in times of great distress. I've seen it over the last few years, having reported there various different events, but most notably some of the most shocking terror attacks in recent years. And the French have a strength and a power within them, and they will coalesce around this building as well, I'm sure. But for tonight, we're still watching these flames. They are not out yet. So talk of restoration, I think, won't be starting until the morning, I hope.
Yeah, and perhaps it is too soon to talk about restoration at all, because this is just breaking. 2 minutes ago, the Associated Press, they released a statement from the French Interior Ministry officials saying firefighters might not be able to save the Notre Dame Cathedral. So I want to go back to John Dickus, an American who's teaching in Paris. What do you make of that statement that this iconic cathedral may not be able to be saved at all?
So for the first time, about 90 seconds ago, for the first time in 3 hours, I saw flames starting to lick up from the two rectangular towers near the front of the cathedral. And I can't see the front from here. I'm looking at the cathedral from the back, so I can see that the roof is gone, and I can see so much of it is gone already. The two towers are in the front are sort of the two things that have been standing all day. But it's really clear that this fire is not over yet. The fire is smaller than it was an hour ago, but it's clearly still threatening the front of the cathedral.
Wow. I want to go to Krupali Krushe. She's a professor here in the U.S. that can kind of speak to if this restoration could potentially happen. Are you there, Krupali? Just want to get your thoughts on this.
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
Yeah, what do you think about the tweet from the Interior Ministry saying that restoration may not be possible?
So a cathedral of this scale is extremely difficult to restore. First of all, the fire was big and extensive. Like we just heard, one of the towers onto the left side of the building is now starting to also have fire in it. These cause problems and stress to the interior of the building. The shell of the structure is stone. It has light buttresses, but the interior is completely wooden to create that lightness of the building in Gothic tradition. Restoring something like this is going to take a lot of time and trouble. One of the biggest churches recently that have been restored to the scale after a fire in World War II was in Dresden at the Frauenkirche in Germany. It took millions of dollars to recreate the building, and some of the works of art are going to be lost forever.
So what are the next steps? I mean, we're looking at these images again of this spire burning, this spire falling down, and the big flames from earlier, and then also the nighttime shot. Okay, so tomorrow comes. What are the next moves?
So the first thing they will have to do is, of course, contain the fire. The next thing that will be done, and it'll have to be done by firefighters plus certain structural scholars, to go in and evaluate what can be restored or what can be rescued before it goes down completely. This is a very difficult situation because the building has to cool down and has to be seen as what pieces are still rescuable. After that, there has to be a complete overall understanding of the reconstruction of this building, which may take at least a period of 5 years in process. So something that is 700 years old is now today lost in a day. And getting it back would take immense amount of effort, time, and money.
Yeah, so the preservation is definitely going to take some time. Someone described it as 600 years of history burning down. Terry, I just want to go back to you. You had mentioned earlier in the other ABC News report that 16 religious statues were removed for cleaning before all of this fire started. So that's at least something that has been saved.
And that might be the seed of the new spire. They were the statues of the apostles and other key figures in the life of Jesus that were surrounding the spire, and they had just been removed. There was some video of it, I believe, by helicopter in part from the spire so that they could be cleaned. They were brought to safety and so will be preserved. That's part of the history of this cathedral as well. The French Revolution, in its outrage and determination to erase Christianity from France and replace it with the cult of reason, that's what they called it, the cult of reason, famously went after the facade of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and all the medieval statues of the saints at that time were destroyed. We see there the statues of the apostles being brought down from the spire before the fire a few days ago, and so they will be preserved. And one can imagine them occupying a place of even greater honor in the church, the cathedral that will rise from the ashes that we are seeing being made tonight. But the French Revolution destroyed that facade. You go to it now, and it is very beautiful, but it's not the one from 800 years ago. Or 700 years ago. It's new, and the life of the cathedral is one of building and rebuilding and neglect and construction and faith waxing and waning. That's one of the reasons it has such an emotional pull on us. It speaks to the centuries and the life in those centuries, and I think that those statues will occupy a special place in the next life of Notre Dame de Paris.
Yeah, and Krupali, I just want to go back to you. How, in terms of preservation, how do they maintain the stained glass and some of the different parts of the structure so it stays intact?
So in the case of the Notre Dame Cathedral, there are three main components. There are the flying buttresses, very thin walls to be able to get the height that the Gothic architecture had. It is one of the earliest examples. This building is one of the earliest examples of high Gothic cathedrals being built, and it's the tallest, one of the tallest ones. It had the stained glass inbuilt in it. The rose windows are very big in scale. Getting them to be built in that structure requires a lot of lead and structural framework around it. So those are, can be very difficult to reconstruct or rebuild. We know that the front rose window is still, as I see on the video footage, is still intact, and I hope that will stay if the fire is contained. The fire is still much better than it was an hour ago. So I'm hoping then the restoration of that is not going to be that difficult. You still have a lot of soot that's going to be produced from the fire that's staining the interiors of the church. So there's rebuilding and there is removal of large amount of, black charred surfaces that are going to be created everywhere. A lot of artwork is getting lost in this period, but can be restored with a very minute prescribed understanding of removing these surfaces from the overall stonework.
And John, if you're still with us, just in terms of, the next days you're seeing this burn down now, how do you imagine this will impact the people in Paris and in all of France in the very short term?
I mean, this cathedral is such a symbol to so many people in Paris and in France and all around the world, right? I mean, people come from, you go there any day of the week and you see people who've traveled from all corners of the world to come visit this building just because it's so beautiful and so iconic and has so much history to it. And I mean, there's still in front of my house right now, this fire's been burning for close to 3 hours now, and there's still a crowd of pedestrians on the street and on the bridge looking out at it who still just can't believe what they're seeing. This is just a devastating experience for anyone who lives here, anyone who visits this city, who comes to this city, who loves this city. It's horrible to watch.
Can you just give us an idea of how close you are to the Notre Dame when you say you're right across the street? I mean, is it something where you can feel the heat from the fire?
No, I'm on the 6th floor. I'm close enough that I can certainly smell the smoke, but no, I can't feel the heat from here. Yeah, and does it look like, from your perspective, that the fire is actually getting smaller from when we spoke last? Yes, the fire is not out, though. I mean, this fire is still burning, and it's still really terrible to see. It's smaller than it was. It's gone down from sort of below. The fire was originally above the level where the roof was, and the fire is now below that. You can see it from the east through some of the broken windows. But it's very clearly still big. When you look at the size of the fire compared to the size of the hoses that they have on it, it still looks enormous. Yeah. Terry, I want to go back to you. As I said before, President Macron, he was set to talk to the French people tonight. They have the yellow vest crisis going on, and now he has to switch paths and talk about this horrific tragedy. What kind of impact do you think that will have to sort of switch gears?
Well, it's a test of leadership, these kinds of events that happen in the lives of countries. And people look to their leaders for a couple of things: to speak for the nation, to speak for the people, the feeling that the French people have in these hours as they watch Notre Dame burn, but also to have a plan. To say, here's what we'll do. We're gonna put out this fire. We're gonna deal with it, and we're gonna move forward. And it will be an object of this government and of this nation to make sure that this is not the last chapter in the history of this cathedral. It is, as you say, a very challenging time for France. I think our guests in Paris can speak more to this than I can, but it is a time of unrest. Emmanuel Macron, I was there covering his election a couple of years back in the courtyard of the Louvre, where it seemed France was full of hope. A new France had it seemed, come forward in the election of Emmanuel Macron, a young man whose election was attributed in many ways to a very diverse group of people, younger people coming to the polls. And yet the reforms that the French economy, many people think, need, that he's tried to instill, have not gone forward. People are resisting it and don't think he's got the right ideas. And so it is a difficult time for France. This makes it more difficult, but as I say, there is in this, for Emmanuel Macron, an opportunity to demonstrate the leadership that people need at a moment like this.
Yeah, and as we see the images there, the cathedral is obviously still burning. It's 4 p.m. Eastern time in New York, and Paris is 6 hours ahead, meaning it's well into the night there, almost midnight. And Terry, as we mentioned before, it's the start of the Holy Week. We're going to have Easter on Friday. You know, how would this just totally shift how people are going to be celebrating, especially all of the people who went to the cathedral for Mass?
Well, that's an interesting question. Obviously, Easter predates even the ancient Cathedral of Notre Dame. It's been going on a long time before and will go on in the future. But for that community, certainly for the people who worship there on a regular basis, that's been disrupted. But also for Catholics in particular in France, it's a very difficult moment. But I will bet you, and I don't think it'll be ready by Easter, certainly, but as soon as they can have a Mass, a Holy Mass, either on the steps or even in the ruins in that cathedral, they will, as a statement of the continuing power of the faith that people have, that Christians have, and how that place has been a place of worship in that faith tradition for so many centuries. But this will be a sad Easter for the Catholics of France and for many people around the world.
And if you're just joining us now, we've been talking about the devastating news out of Paris. The Notre Dame Cathedral is still on fire as we speak. A 12th century structure that is looking like it's going to be completely damaged. So I want to go to Simon Jones, who's actually on the ground and was an eyewitness to this terrible tragedy. Simon, can you kind of describe what you experienced?
I was just standing on the bridge, one of the bridges that goes over the river, and I was watching it with crowds of people, and there were people literally crying, weeping openly on the street, many people, and we were watching the spire and hoping that could stay, and then it just collapsed in front of us, and a huge gasp went out, and you could just feel this wave of emotion go over the crowd, myself included. And then we just stood there transfixed, watching the flames just eat the roof. And it's just a truly devastating experience watching this terrible fire.
And where are you from? Are you visiting? Or are you actually from Paris?
I live in Paris. I am actually a tour guide for Like About Tours in Paris. And each day I stand in front of the Notre Dame Cathedral and I give a speech about it and talk about its history. And I'm just in shock, just absolutely in shock. I've lived here for 6 years, and I look at that amazing cathedral every single day, and I can't believe this. I just can't believe it.
Yeah, certainly a tragedy, not just for the people of Paris, but for everyone around the world, and kind of feel sad for anyone who hasn't been able to visit the cathedral. It won't be the same when they see it the next time. So the Vatican issued a statement about the terrible fire that has devastated Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. French President Emmanuel Macron is treating the fire as a national emergency. And Terry, if you're still with us, I just want to go back for anyone that's joining now, just reiterating how devastating this is for the people of France, what this actually means, not just a church burning down, but a monument, an icon, the significance.
It is an icon, isn't it? And it looks like it has been completely engulfed and risks the entire edifice being destroyed, although we're ways from that. It has been absolutely devastated by this fire, and so has then this central icon of Paris. Millions upon millions of people who visit Paris every year. That's one of the prime destinations, if not the #1 destination, because it is the expression of Paris dating back, 800 years. And it has been the scene of so much of the history of Paris and of France that it is really right at the heart of French life and French culture. They're proud of it. They love it. As James was reporting, one of the officials of the cathedral had said, we're watching tonight an old friend pass away. And in some ways, that is what it feels like to so many people around the world, but especially the French. As I said, though, this is a cathedral which has seen so much history and so many challenges over that history that I think one way to look at it, if you are heartbroken about it, and so many are, is that this is another chapter. There will be more.
Yeah, and kind of an eerie statement that a Notre Dame spokesperson put out earlier saying everything is burning, nothing will remain from the frame. But Terry, as you suggest, it will be rebuilt.
It undoubtedly will. It undoubtedly will. I don't think the people of Paris or the people of France or the Catholics or others around the world who love that church will allow it to become a parking lot. It's not going to happen. They are going to rebuild a house of worship. They've been worshiping there since, I believe, on that site since Roman times. Since the 5th or 6th century, prior to the cathedral, there was a place of Christian worship there. So that 1,500-year tradition of prayers and worship and faith on that side is not going to end. It will be rebuilt, even though this is just a terrible, terrible night, really, for that place.
Yeah, so just sort of recapping, we know that the origin of the fire is not really known, even though it was maybe started by the $7 million restoration project on the spire, which we saw earlier, that completely fell and burned down. The roof has caved in, and one of the eyewitnesses that we were speaking to, John Dickus, said that the fire may have spread to one of the towers. As we know, there's no injuries as of now, which is very, very good, and they're continuing to try to put the fire out. Terry, any more words, any thoughts just in terms of, like, where people go from here? I mean, when people wake up tomorrow, they were walking past the Notre Dame today, and then tomorrow you wake up and probably still remnants of the smell of smoke and no church.
Well, that's a very sad moment, isn't it? And I think there are people who have been reminded to a much different degree, but the sight of the towers in New York going down and smoldering for weeks afterwards, so much of a loss of life there, an act of war. This an accident, an act of God, I suppose, in some ways, by some people's measurement. But there's no question that it'll be very, very sad. And I can't help but thinking, having been there so many times, I lived in London, worked for ABC over there for several years, and visited prior to that over the years, lived in Europe before. It will be different. There's a hole now where that magnificent edifice was, where that house of worship was. And yet, once again, looking ahead, look, I know that it is unlikely if they undertake a reconstruction along the lines of this beautiful building, I won't be around when it's finished. And I think the people who begin work, putting one stone on top of another, raising the roof again in that place, will think of it in those terms, that this is a gift that must now be given again to France and to the world generations hence. And so the work will begin. The work is underway right now with the bravery of firefighters all day trying to get control of this massive blaze. But the work then will go on. And I think as people go to Paris, they'll see it, they'll mourn, and they'll also recognize right away that it will rise again.
Yeah, I want to go to some sound from Alistair Bruce, who's just talking about, the significance of the cathedral in her life.
I want to bring in Alistair Bruce from Sky News, a colleague of ours, a respected colleague and a longtime journalist for Sky News. And Alistair, this is just unfortunate and saddening all over the world image that we're watching play out here at Notre Dame Cathedral.
It's absolutely devastating. I used to go when I was much younger to play the organ in that cathedral and know what an important icon it is for the people of Paris and of France. And it really has been at the center of French history, going right back to the 12th century and the 11th century when it was built. And we saw that spire, or the flesh, collapse earlier on, and the original one had been put up in the 13th and 14th centuries, and there was a new one put up in the 18th century. And what's so tragic about what it means to Roman Catholics living in France is that this is in the very heart of the ancient capital city, on this tiny island where the kings of France used to live. And up in that spire, in the little cathedral that used to mark the direction of the wind, used to be kept a tiny piece of the true cross and a little bit of St. Denis and St. Genevieve, who were the two patron saints of Paris. So this is a hugely important place for Catholics, for the history of France, and it has been at the center of the story of the Parisian people almost since the Frankish people first established a great monarchy and a great center of power and influence in that part of the world.
Alistair, you spoke of playing the organ as a boy at Notre Dame. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's been able to say that before. And obviously there is concern at this hour about whether or not anything inside that cathedral will be saved. We've now been watching these flames for well more than an hour and a half here, but certainly you must be concerned as you look at these images about what, if anything, will be saved.
What I find fascinating is that there was a reservoir of water kept between the two main towers in order to deal with a fire should it occur. Now, for some reason, there has not been a possibility to deploy that, or we will find out later on. But I know from the cathedrals that I still visit, and I adore visiting these old buildings, most of them put up centuries ago. They're full, originally, of tinderbox dry wood, which is around the strength of which the great stone ceilings are built. And you can imagine that on top of that, you've got lead, which is the most resilient metal to create a roof. But once the fire gets into those old timbers and then is further heated by the sheer strength of the heat in burning lead, it is incredibly difficult for anybody to manage that fire. And I would imagine that this is the greatest tragedy to the arts of France that we are witnessing now, and it will take almost 100 years to put it right.
You describe perfectly the architecture and how old it is, the lead that surrounds the wood, but once you get to the wood, how quickly it ignites and how likely little hope there is at this point other than protecting people in the vicinity and other structures in the vicinity of Notre Dame Cathedral. But much of this fire is going to be, certainly, it would seem, allowed to do its destructive work, at least when it comes to the spire, which we've already seen collapse, the top of the cathedral now on fire. You were listening to the description from Alistair Bruce, a colleague of ours at Sky News overseas, who once as a boy used to travel to Notre Dame to play the cathedral.
All right, you're joining us now as we continue coverage of breaking news outside of Paris. One of the most iconic cathedrals in the world, the Notre Dame, is on fire and in flames as we speak. Paris is 6 hours ahead of New York Eastern Time. So right there in Paris, it's about 10:19 p.m. and you're seeing images live as the structure continues to burn. We know that there were no injuries. We know that this fire may have started, it hasn't been confirmed, but may have started from a renovation project on the spire, which fell to the ground hours ago when it burned and toppled down. The roof has also caved in, and the French Interior Ministry officials, they put out a tweet saying that firefighters might not be able to save the Notre Dame Cathedral. So I want to go to John Dickus. He's an American who's teaching in Paris, who's been with us this whole time, giving us updates on what the fire looks like. John, can you just sort of describe the scene now? You are right across the street, as you've mentioned.
Sure. I'm right across the river, actually. The fire is smaller than it was, but it's the damage that's already been done to the cathedral is just horrifying. It thankfully looks like it's no longer as close to the two front towers as it was, but it still looks like it's still a very, very large fire compared to the size of the hoses that they've been able to get on it. And it's no longer right up next to some of the Gothic windows the way it was a half hour ago or an hour ago. But it's still burning very bright and very large, and as Paris has gotten darker, it has really taken on a really dark feeling. As you can see, so much of the cathedral that was there this morning is just gone now.
And just very quickly, I know earlier with David Muir, you had described how the cathedral was burning, and then right across in the same skyline, you could see the Eiffel Tower sparkling as it does every night. Can you describe seeing that sort of surreal image?
Yeah, absolutely. At 9 o'clock, the Eiffel Tower started sparkling, and to see that juxtaposed next to Notre Dame as the flames were still leaping out of the cathedral was just, it was really unsettling to see. It was bizarre and surreal. And sort of made you see the entire skyline of Paris at once, and you know, sort of bring home what an iconic building this is. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, and you sort of reminded you of all the people who come from all around the world to see it. And just a few minutes ago at 10 o'clock, the Eiffel Tower was due to sparkle again. It sparkles on the hour. Once it gets dark, and it didn't sparkle at 10. It looks like they've suspended that while the fire is still burning, I would imagine.
Yeah, so I want to bring in Steve McGill, who's a Jersey City fire chief. Steve, it's interesting because earlier President Trump, he tweeted that obviously this massive fire at the cathedral is horrible to watch, but he suggested flying water tanks could be used to put it out, and he added, must act quickly. Could that have been an option?
No, in a major city like that, you're not going to be able to get an airplane low enough, and just the sheer weight of the water that's going to come out of that will probably cause further damage to that building that you don't want to have. Plus, the water's not going to get into the areas where the fire is burning, which is under the roof, which is now collapsed, and all hot spots throughout in the walls. So the only way to get to it is a direct attack with hose lines, with firefighters getting into that building, which right now is too difficult or dangerous to do due to the potential collapse hazard.
Yeah, and can you just talk about the collapse zone? Because, you know, you can't really... The firefighters can't get too close inside because something could potentially fall on them, right? The structure could actually collapse.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see those two towers, I don't know how high they are. They're several stories high, and even the main part of the church is probably about 4 or 5 or 6 stories high. And say that's about 60 or 70 feet, your collapse zone has to be double that distance away from those walls, because if they collapse, it'll come down, the rubble will fly all over the place, and you can really endanger the lives of the firefighters. This old type construction has these flying buttresses, they call them, which help support the walls on the sides. But without that roof structure, a part of that whole system, those walls could probably collapse inward and outward also, endangering the lives of people that are inside or outside that building.
Yeah, and Terry Moran has been with us the entire time as we've been reporting, and I'm making you repeat yourself, but for everyone joining us now, people have been describing this in different ways. 600 years of history burning down, a symbol of humanity, a cultural tragedy. Explain why people are using these phrases and these words with such gravity.
Because it was so beautiful, Kimberly. And because it represented a universal human aspiration, which is to be one with the divine, with God. This was a house of worship. This was a prayer in stone and timber and glass, and it is now collapsed. And I think that is so profoundly moving to so many around the world, and because it was so beautiful and so ancient and such a center of French civilization. It's one of those buildings that people all over the world, millions upon millions, knew about. There really aren't that many. How many buildings would have such an impact? We know that there were no lives lost in this fire, thank God, literally, or people injured at this point. And one thinks of the firefighters, and thoughts and prayers for their safety go out. But the 9/11, the Twin Towers coming down, it was the human loss, much more profound than just stone and timber and glass, that had everybody so moved. This is the loss of a building, and there just aren't that many buildings so historic and so beloved and so iconic around the world. And I think that's what has people moved. And I also think that is why it will be rebuilt. It won't be the same. It can't. It may even look different in some degree, depending on how much of the structure is lost. But there will be another Notre Dame of Paris. There will be another cathedral built there. and so this night will pass.
Yes, I like you talking about the speaking optimistically and speaking of the resilience of the French people. I want to go back to Steve McGill. What are the chances that this fire is not put out tonight? Is this something that's still going to be burning early into the morning?
Yeah, I'm sure this is going to be burning well into the morning due to the fact that the heavy timbers that were inside that building that held that up are still burning under the collapsed roof. There's going to be numerous hot spots where the firefighters are going to have to actually get in, dig through the debris to try and knock those fires down. It's not easy. Once again, they'll have to go into that collapse zone and put their lives in danger to try and put that fire out. So they'll be there for a long time. What most people aren't talking about, too, is just what they're going through right now. They're probably extremely exhausted being there for this many hours. So they're going to have a lot of reliefs come in to help them out. So this is going to be a very long, labor-intensive fire.
Yeah, and can you just give people an idea of, like, what they actually have to do? Because I've heard people saying, you know, they're trying to save some of the artifacts and save portions of the church. But how do you do that when there's literally a massive flame billowing out of the top of it? How do you save anything?
Well, you do your best. I mean, our job is to protect life and property. And when there's no lives involved other than the firefighters right now, we want to save as much of that property as possible. So they're going to be doing the same thing as if, with these antiquities, as if that's a person in there. I'm sure that's a very historic place for the people in Paris and France. And they're going to do their best to get that stuff out to save it.
How likely is it that the renovation was actually part of what started this flame? I mean, the church seems to be made out of lots of different materials, but primarily wood. And then you have, you know, the stained glass and other things. But how is the renovation impacting, like, what happened?
You know, it's tough to say with the renovation, but we do have several fires when buildings are under renovation. Walls will be opened up, voids will be exposed. There's a lot more people there now, so with people comes accidents. So anything could happen. Could be discarded debris, electrical in nature, or anything. You know, when you have that many people in an area where normally people aren't, and it's exposed now to all the combustibles are exposed, any little spark or anything could ignite something like that. And once that fire starts going, it's very, very difficult to get out, especially if it started up high by that spire area. There's almost no way of getting up there.
All right, Steve, I want to go to Julia McFarland. She's in the London Bureau. Julia, can you just give us an idea of some of the French people and their reaction to this? Obviously, we're talking about it in the U.S., but for the people in France, this is deeply emotional for all of them.
Kimberly, this is so much more than just a building. It's so much more than just a landmark. If anyone's been monitoring social media today, you'll have heard the gasps and you'll have seen people sobbing and crying as they watch the flames engulf this cathedral. It's really so much more than just a landmark. It's really a focal point for Paris. A lot of people gathered outside the church to lay flowers during terror attacks. A lot of people from all over the world have been welcomed and sheltered by this church. And of course, as we said, although a lot of us associate Paris with the Eiffel Tower is only a couple hundred years old. This church has stood for almost 1,000 years. And what people are incredibly worried about tonight is that beautiful rose stained glass window. What is all of this going to have done to it? That glass can be repainted and maybe restored, but the paint that has been on those panes itself is centuries old. That cannot be replaced, that cannot be restored, and there are fears of what the heat might have done to this window. There's of course concerns about the relics and the artifacts inside. officials and firefighters have been trying to move people as well as these priceless treasures out of the church, as well as securing the outside, trying to save what they can. But of course, a lot of the treasures of this church are built into the architecture. There's this ancient medieval wooden frame in the roof that we think may have been lost to the flames. Of course, by the time morning comes up, it'll be easier to assess the damage. But all of Paris, all of France, and of course much of the world is watching in horror at what is happening right now on the Ile-de-France. This cathedral, you know, it's seen not only desecrations and attacks, but it's seen, you know, it's gone all the way back to the Crusades. It's seen the Napoleonic Wars, the First World War, the Second World War, and now it's just incredible to think that what may be just an accidental fire is jeopardizing this majestic building that has stood for so long.
Yeah, and it's going to be absolutely devastating. It's devastating now, but it's going to be even more devastating to see what it looks like in the morning. I want to go to Eva Nguyen. She is also in Paris and was witness to this tragedy. Okay, I'm breaking in here. I want to go to Cardinal Dolan. He's actually outside on Fifth Avenue. Let's take his sound.
I just thought it would be extraordinarily appropriate if we publicly expressed, on behalf of our beloved St. Patrick's Cathedral and on behalf of the citizens of New York, the love, the solidarity, the prayers, and the sorrow that we feel over the devastating fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in the heart of Paris, and indeed the very heart of Europe, and certainly the heart of civilization in so many ways. I could only imagine, Monsignor Ritchie, what it would do to all of us if a fire struck St. Patrick's. We would all sense that there was a fire in our home, because that's what a cathedral really is. It's a spiritual home where people go in moments of tears and in moments of smiles. And this is a moment of tears for Notre Dame on the Ile de la Cité, right smack dab in the middle of Paris. It would be difficult, I presume second maybe to St. Peter's Basilica, to think of a church that more represents love and God's presence among us, and the ability of a church to lift our minds and hearts back to the Lord, the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. So while our sorrow couldn't come close to that gripping the heart of the French nation, it is certainly sincere and it's certainly deep. And I'm just hoping that the expression of that solidarity might bring a little consolation to the people of Paris. Monsignor and I have just been inside St. Patrick's, filled with people as usual in prayer, also filled with people approaching the sacrament of confession on this Reconciliation Monday as we get ready for a Good Friday and Easter, and all of them are commenting with pain about the fire at Notre Dame. Would you be interested in a email that I just sent my brother Archbishop in Paris? Let me just read it. It's short. His name is Michel Aupetit. Michel Aupetit. He was here to visit maybe only 6 months ago, as was his predecessor, Cardinal Ventois, who spoke to me with such warmth and pride and gratitude about their efforts in Paris to restore and repair Notre Dame, and was so interested in what we were doing here at St. Patrick's. So I wrote him today, my brother Michel, the people of New York unite with you and the citizens of Paris in sorrow over today's devastating fire. We here love St. Patrick's. It is our spiritual home for people of all faiths. Thus can we but imagine the sadness of your people as they watch their family home of the soul reduced to ashes. Count on our love, prayers, support, and solidarity. This Holy Week teaches us that, like Jesus, death brings life. Today's dying, we trust, will bring rising. Fraternally, Timothy. Thank you. Monsignor, thanks. you probably know more about the details of the fire than I do, so I don't know if I'd be of much help in the information about the fire. But is there anything you wanted to ask? I know, Monsignor, I think it deepens our appreciation that when we did the repair and renewal and restoration of St. Patrick's, we took special care of fire prevention. We really are grateful for the attention that the New York Fire Department gives to us all the time. They inspect us how often?
3 or 4 times a year.
And they placed a new mist system upstairs.
All right, you were just listening to Cardinal Dolan outside of Fifth Avenue in New York speaking about this horrific fire. I want to go to Eva Nguyen. She's in Paris and was also able to witness this firsthand. Eva, what was the experience like for you? It's now nearly 4 hours later. How are you feeling about everything?
Yes, I'm still shocked about everything what's happened here. Like, it was a normal day. I was just going to catch the bus after work, and I saw the huge smoke. Everybody just stopped on the street, and they didn't move at all. They were just looking in the same direction. From this point of view, we couldn't even say what is going on. So when I get in the bus, we start driving, and we start to see the huge fire going from Notre Dame. Like, a lot of people just stopped moving on the street, start recording. I heard some people screaming on the street. In one moment, like, the bus driver stopped, and people start to run out from the bus and just start to crying. I heard people singing, so it was really emotional for people in here. Like, we still can't believe what's going on.
And what's happening now? Are you still close to the church, or have you retired to wherever you were staying? Like, or are you still out on the street?
No, I'm at home, but I'm still checking what's going on. And people are still there. Like, there's a lot of people standing and singing in front of the church, because it was really like a heart of Paris. And everybody are devastated, and we are just waiting. It's still burning, and it's really painful to see all these things.
Yeah, it's captivating images, and you're watching like everyone else is watching. I want to go to Steve McGill, the Jersey City Fire Chief. Steve, how long do you think it will take to actually put this fire out?
Yeah, it's tough to say, but from what I see on TV, it's, this is going to be going on for hours. I mean, that structure is probably a couple of city blocks long or so, and with all the debris that collapsed in, it's going to be tough to get all the fire out and to get into those hot spots. Like I said before, with the collapse zone and the potential for the collapse, it's very, very dangerous area to be in. So they'll be there all night, and I'm sure there'll be a shift, a change or two in between. And probably there'll be days after that just trying to do the investigation to see what started the fire.
And can you just give people an idea really fast of, how powerful this flame is? Because earlier we saw those images of like 2 firefighters trying to do the best they can. And obviously now more have showed up. But how big is this flame? How powerful is it to actually try to manage?
Yeah, you probably have 1,000 degrees of heat inside that structure, and even the biggest hose lines and the ladder pipes and deck guns that they have on their apparatus are going to be way too small to put this type of volume of fire out. So even with the river right there, they could probably pump right out of that out of the river, but there's only so much apparatus and manpower and staffing that you can get there to fight those flames. And once it gets going the way it did on this, it's very, very hard to stop it from continuing on. So, I mean, they're doing the best to save the structure. I see those twin towers that were there look like they're still in pretty good shape. So I'm sure they're doing the best that they can to save whatever they can.
Yeah, the fire chief in Paris, he says it's unclear if city firefighters will be able to keep a fire at Notre Dame from spreading and causing more destruction. He also said that outside the cathedral, the crews battled the blaze from both the exterior and interior, and he said, we are not sure we are capable of stopping the spreading. If it collapses, you can imagine how important the damage will be. But I just want to ask you really quick, Steve, if it does collapse, all of the firefighters who are working are not in the collapse zone, correct?
Yeah, that's the number one thing for the fire chief there is to make sure that no one's in that collapse zone. And you know, if he does have people working inside, which I'm sure he does right now in those two tower sections, which doesn't look like it's gotten any of the fire in there, they're right there trying to stop it at that point to stop it from spreading into the rest of the building. But like you said, yeah, there's no telling what's going to happen. You don't know how bad the fire is internally. And in those vaults that are underground, possibly, where all the debris collapsed into, it's going to be very, very difficult to stop it and put it out. But eventually, it will go out, and they're doing the best that they can right now, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's absolutely devastating. I want to go back to Julia McFarlane in our London bureau. Julia, as we've mentioned several times, it's the start of Holy Week. Millions of people, 13, 14 million people come to the Notre Dame every year. And this week is one of the busiest weeks. Just talk about the impact that would have on this city.
Absolutely, Kimberly. Not just one of the most important weeks, but also remember that this is Easter time, and whilst we have Holy Thursday and Good Friday, and when Christians commemorate the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, they also have the joy of Easter Sunday and Easter Monday. And of course, there'll be Catholics who will have been planning on going to the Easter Vigil, going to celebrate Easter Sunday Mass. There will be people who have flown into Paris or are planning to fly into Paris from around the world to spend this special feast day at the Notre Dame. And so you can imagine that a lot of people will be heartbroken to see these flames. And this, of course, poses a real challenge to the Christian community in France, because, you know, how do they celebrate Easter and the joyful resurrection of Jesus whilst their beloved church is endangered? And of course, who knows what will happen when morning comes. Hopefully the cathedral will still be standing. Hopefully it will have survived, but it will of course be massively devastated and damaged from this. And I think we can expect Pope Francis, he's already spoken tonight about the fire at the cathedral. He's already said that the prayers are coming from the Vatican and praying for Notre Dame, and I think we can expect him to say something about Notre Dame on Easter Sunday, and indeed pretty much all throughout Holy Week. But this is going to be an especially sorrowful Easter period for France's Christians and Christians all over the world.
All right, Julia, I appreciate that. I want to go back to Eva really quick. Eva, I'm just curious if you've talked to anyone else that is in your circle about, you know, how they were planning to celebrate this week and now how they won't be able to.
Yes, of course. When I started to record this fire that was on fire, like my old friends started to text me and they couldn't believe it. They were really in pain. Like they are all sad, and for now we have no idea what will happen the next day. Like probably I will talk with them tomorrow at work, but to be honest now, like for sure everyone here will be grieving, because this beautiful building was in horrifying picture today, and we are still like very, very hard inside about this.
Yeah, and I just want to note that, yes, the firefighters are, of course, working as hard as they can, and the fire department gave an update saying that the most precious artwork inside of the cathedral has been saved. So just to recap, the Notre Dame Cathedral is still burning. There is no real cause yet. No one knows. There's very little info on what may have caused it, but they're thinking it may have something to do with the renovation of the spire that fell earlier today. No injuries are reported, and as of right now, 400 firefighters are responding. Paris is 6 hours ahead of New York, so that means it's 10:44 there right now. And as you see the live pictures, it's still burning. And so, as we know, the roof collapsed and the spire completely fell. President Trump had suggested that maybe we could, the people of France could dump water on the top of the roof. But as we spoke to one of the fire chiefs in New Jersey, he told us that that wouldn't be possible given that the structure is so old. It's of wood. It would have damaged it more than helped it out. This is obviously pretty devastating for all the people of France. It's not just a cathedral burning. This was the heart of their nation. They referred to the Notre Dame Cathedral as Our Lady. French President Emmanuel Macron, he also tweeted saying that, you know, this was devastating. He was supposed to speak to the French people tonight, addressing the economy and other issues, but now all of the attention has turned to this. So they're continuing to try to put the fire out. But before we tell you more, let's just go back and revisit some of the images from earlier today. And our coverage continues now with Sky News.
Just tell us, how do you feel when you watch this? Just give us an idea of the mood here. It's kind of deathly quiet, isn't it? There's a really strange, eerie sense of people. People are just stunned.
It's totally eerie. It's totally weird. There's total awestruck. It's just like, this is an icon of Paris, and it's just shocking. It's totally shocking.
And you're visiting, are you?
I'm visiting, yes. I visit regularly, but it's just... And I often come here. I was here on Friday. Everything was normal, and now it's all changed for all time.
What does the Notre Dame Cathedral mean to you?
Paris is ground zero, you know. This is the centre of Paris.
It's the heart of the city, isn't it? I mean, it is the very heart of the city.
The soul, the heart.
As well as the Eiffel Tower, it's hard to think of two buildings.
Absolutely, and it's just so shocking. Yeah.
Yeah, people are struggling to find the words to describe what has happened here.
Well, that was a little bit earlier on in Paris. As you can see, the sun has set this evening. The only light on our screens coming from those flames that have been ravaging that 850-year-old iconic Gothic cathedral for some, well, nearly 4 hours now. Images continuing to come into Sky News Centre to show the extent of the damage, and firefighters telling the world that they may not be able to stop the advance of the flames and protect the integrity of the entire structure. It may well be lost altogether. This is the latest coming to us from the French capital this evening, Notre Dame de Paris, the heart of the city, where, of course, it's thought a fire, at least cathedral officials are saying a fire started during routine restoration work that's been going on for several months. You can see some of the scaffolding in your shot there still standing. Much of it has also collapsed into the centre of the cathedral as the roof and indeed the spire collapsed earlier this evening. This all unfolded earlier this evening as Emmanuel Macron was expected to give a much anticipated address to the country about an ongoing political crisis that he'd been facing, which he has since cancelled and is treating this evening as a national emergency. He's been attending the scene and speaking to firefighters for some time now. We haven't heard from him yet. We wonder if he may well try and say a few words to the camera, but you can see from his handshakes there with firefighters his gratitude to these people that in these moments of grave danger have to themselves put themselves in danger. He tweeted earlier saying, "I am sad tonight to see this part of all of us burn," and it is a sentiment certainly in terms of the firefighters that we've seen echoed from all corners. Indeed, from the Prime Minister this evening, she said, the British Prime Minister, I should add, her thoughts are with the people of France tonight and with the emergency services who are fighting the terrible blaze at the Notre Dame Cathedral. And indeed, a sentiment that has been shared by the Vatican this evening. Of course, France being a predominantly Catholic country, Notre Dame being a Catholic cathedral, Our Lady, of course, referring to the Virgin Mary. The Vatican this evening having said that the Holy See has seen with shock and sadness the news of the terrible fire that has devastated the Cathedral of Notre Dame, symbol of Christianity in France and in the world. The statement said that the Vatican is praying for firefighters and for those who are doing everything possible to confront this dramatic situation. So that's the kind of reaction that we've been getting so far this evening. Also, the latest we've seen this evening, the Louvre Museum has described the blaze as a tragedy for World Heritage. That's just in this evening. A comment on the Art Museum's official Twitter account said the fire which has struck Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris is a tragedy for World Heritage. The Louvre expresses its deepest admiration and solidarity with those who are currently battling the flames. The Church of England's Director of Cathedrals and Church Buildings, Becky Clark, has also said that the fire was heartbreaking. Well, let's speak now to the Dean of Canterbury, the very Reverend Robert Willis. Good evening to you. You'll have heard me in the last few moments saying that the Vatican have been commenting on this evening, and indeed the Church of England watching what's happening over the channel in horror as well, I'm sure.
Very much so, very much. This is the Monday of Holy Week, and so the Archbishop and I had a service in Canterbury Cathedral with a full nave there, and were able to say prayers just an hour ago, remembering our friends in Notre Dame and Paris, and really praying for all the people of France and all those who love this place as a symbol of Christian civilization in Europe and throughout the world.
Have you personally visited the Notre Dame in Paris?
Many times, many times. I've been to services there, to masses, and prayed there, and it's really something that you take as part of your mental landscape, really. When you go to Paris, Notre Dame is simply there, and then in just a few hours we watch in horror as this scene unfolds, and many people were weeping about this as they were heart and soul with their brothers and sisters in France.
What do you make of that reaction from people weeping in the street? We've heard of people singing Ave Maria. It's been a very moving response, hasn't it?
I think it has. I think very often the holy places, Canterbury itself, a great place of pilgrimage, are taken for granted, and that's a nice thing. They're part of our landscape. They're also, as has been said by the Louvre, huge heritage centres which call people to creativity. And you don't imagine outside wartime anything is going to happen of this magnitude. So it seems so tragic that having survived the Second World War and been the place where citizens of Paris gather to give thanks for the liberation of Paris, then on an ordinary afternoon in April, this suddenly occurs, and it is utterly heartbreaking.
Just to interrupt the interview for a brief moment, just to say...
of course.
I'm afraid to say that we have heard in the last few moments from Reuters news agency that one of the firefighters tackling the blaze has been seriously injured. And, of course, this has been the great fear as the blaze has been ripping through the cathedral this evening, that, of course, fire men and women have been putting themselves in danger. But that is the breaking news this evening, that, unfortunately, one firefighter this evening has been seriously injured. The good news, though, that we're hearing... from a French firefighting official is that they can say now that the structure of Notre Dame has been saved from total destruction. They're saying they're feeling much more optimistic than just a few hours ago. I understand that the last hour or so has been absolutely critical. The junior French Interior Minister saying another 3 or 4 hours needed to contain the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral. But that good news, at least this evening, that the fire, to a certain extent, has been able to be stopped from totally destroying the cathedral itself. Let me return to the Very Reverend Robert Willis, the Dean of Canterbury. Sorry to interrupt you there with those breaking lines.
Not
First
at all.
of all,
No,
your response.
I was interested to hear the news, and sorry about the firemen. When seeing the height of those flames, it is miraculous that there hasn't been more injury. But it's good news to hear that the structure, the stone structure, seems to have been saved, and I hope that good news continues over the next few hours, because looking at the west side, that's the one that you face as you approach Notre Dame, the two towers, that is so much a scene which is in all our mental landscapes and engraved in our hearts, I think.
Isn't it just? OK, listen, thanks very much for your reflections, your thoughts, and indeed for your prayers this evening. The Very Reverend Robert Willis, good to talk to you this evening. So,
thank you.
Just as we finish this evening, this hour, just an update really on where we are with that fire, having started at 6 o'clock local time this evening. Flames of up to 30 metres high, spread very, very quickly through the largely wooden interior of the cathedral. The spire collapsing, which will, I think, become something of an iconic moment in this tragedy, collapsing in on itself into the nave, and then a huge cloud of smoke going up into the sky, and that fire really taking hold of that 850-year-old building, a 12th century cathedral right at the heart. The Notre Dame de Paris this evening continuing to burn, but firefighters this evening saying that it has been saved from total destruction.
Sauver et préserver dans sa globalité ce monument de Notre Dame. Pour moi, il faut que c'est... Et peut-être que partie des... À l'intérieur. Ah oui. Pour moi, c'est
Ça, c'est du matériel de pro, c'est un pro.
Ah ben... Non, même pas.
Ah oui, quand même. Oui. Moi, j'aurais pu sortir depuis plus. Voilà, j'aurais été avant, mais je ne comprends pas. Ah oui.